This is a notice for all participants. This is a public meeting and proceedings are being webcast live online. A recording will also be available for playback on the Council's website shortly afterwards. Please note that your name will appear in the live stream and in the recording. Should you not wish for your image to appear on these, please turn off your camera. Third parties should not record or film the local plan hearing sessions, and neither the Council nor the Planning Inspectorate are liable for any third-party recordings. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's now 10 o'clock, so time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells Borough Local Plan. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. Just shortly previously tested my camera and microphone. Welcome along to those of you who haven't attended any of the previous sessions, and welcome back to those of you who have. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. I'll quickly run through some sort of housekeeping and procedural matters. I know that several of you on the call have been, attending these previous sessions, so it's probably all things you've heard before. So apologies for that, but there are some new names around the virtual table, so I will very quickly run through some general housekeeping matters around the hearings and the use of the technology. Before I do so, just a quick note. So the Programme Officer, Charlotte Glancy, can't be with us this week. So we've got Chris Banks, who's stepping in. So Chris is on the call today. So if I could just ask Chris very quickly just to turn his camera and microphone on, just so everyone knows who he is. Morning, Chris.
Morning, everybody.
So as I said, obviously, so it's the same email address as some of you may remember. Charlotte couldn't attend one of the earlier sessions when we were in the town hall, and Hannah stepped in. So obviously Chris is stepping in this week, I think. Chris, all week, is it?
Yes, not Friday though. You've got Hannah on Friday, but
okay. So it's the same program officers. It's Bank Solutions, so it's the same email address. So Charlotte is still the program officer, Charlotte Glancy, and it's still the same email address. It's just that Chris is stepping in to help out this week at the actual hearings. So if you do have any questions, queries about documents, attending any of the sessions, links or anything like that, please do feel free to still contact Charlotte in the first instance, although Chris is on hand this week to help out with any issues with regard to the hearings. I'll quickly run through, obviously, the purpose of today's session and what we're going to be talking about. There's no set agenda. So obviously today we've moved on in the examination, and we're into the sort of the final week of the examination now, really, and the final matters. So this morning we're going to start talking about some of the retail and town centre policies and some of the site allocations in the plan. And then this afternoon we've got a separate session on transport. So for those of you who are attending this afternoon, it is a separate session and it's a separate Zoom invite. So for those attending this afternoon, if you haven't already got the invite, again, please contact Charlotte through the normal email and she can send you the relevant links. So there's no agenda for today. What we'll do, as per previous sessions, then we'll go through the matters, issues and questions document. So the hearings, again, it's a sort of informal discussion really led by myself. So I'll go through the questions. I'll ask questions of the council to start with, and then we'll get a bit of discussion and a debate going around some of the soundness issues. If people do wish to participate in a discussion, and you're more than welcome to, and I actively encourage that, And the best thing to do is use the raise hand function, which is in Zoom. So you may have it in a different place, but I've got mine down at the bottom. So I've got participants, chat, and share screen. So those sort of functions are disabled. And then I've got a reactions button, and I can use raise hand like that. And that tells me that you wish to speak. Rather than sort of going around the room as we would do in the council offices and introduce everybody, what I can ask, if I can ask, please, if it's the first time that you've spoken, so once you raise your hand, I can then see that you wish to speak. If it's the first time that you've spoken, if you could introduce yourself, please, to myself and the hearing, let me know who you are. If you're acting on behalf of a particular client or landowner or developer, that'd be much appreciated. And then again, once you've finished speaking, you can just use the same function to the lower hand as well. So if everyone can keep their cameras and microphones turned off, with the exception when you're speaking, that'd be much appreciated. Obviously, I'll ask that the council keeps their camera and microphone on, also the key people answering questions today. What I would just say about the hearings, as I've said on other sessions, they are an opportunity for you to put your points forward. It's an opportunity to make your representations to myself. What I would just say is, obviously, I've got everybody's Regulation 19 representations, and I've got the hearing statements for those who have submitted it. So please do feel free to sort of engage in the discussion, but just a couple of sort of housekeeping rules, really. Firstly, I don't need to hear everything again, so please don't feel like you need to sort of repeat anything that's in your statement, for example. And equally, when participating in a discussion, please can you stick to the representations that you've made. For example, more than happy for you to get involved, but if we're talking about a particular site, then please only do contribute on the sites that you've commented about or the policies that you've commented about. So the hearings are an opportunity to sort of put your points forward, not to introduce any new ones. So there's a very quick sort of run through of the technology and the format of the hearings and what we're going to be talking about. Said we've been using this technology. I think this is sort of the third week that we've been using it, and it seems to be working perfectly well. There's a couple of issues now and again. If you do have an issue, feel free to sort of log out, log back in, etc. And we will take breaks throughout. So if you're having an issue, so please let myself or Chris Banks know. And again, we can pause and take an adjournment and just allow you time to sort of reboot or turn things on and off again. Any questions from the council before we get going? Any matters arising?
No, nothing from this answer. Thank you.
No? Okay, very good. We will make a start then. So quite a lot to get through today. So the first part of this morning's session, looking at some of the policies, two of them sort of take a comfort break, sort of tea and coffee break mid-morning, and then we'll come back and look at some of the site allocations that we've got in the plan. So the first issue then, dealing with sort of retail town centres and community facilities. So the first issue to look at, which was identified in the matters, issues and questions document, was around the town centre hierarchy. And obviously I'd asked questions there about what's the hierarchy based on, is it accurate, etc. So we find the hierarchy in table 13 of the local plan, which is in policy ED8, and that breaks down the type of centres, was your town centres, rural service centres, etc. We talked earlier on in the examination about making the strategic policies clearer in terms of the hierarchy and the focus of settlements in the borough. As far as the retail hierarchy is concerned, what is the difference between the neighbourhood centres and the villages or the village centres? What are they? So I've read the council statement, and that refers to the retail study. But it seems as if the village centres, they've been informed by something maybe different. Is it the role and function of settlement study? So you just ask the council just to talk to me about how the retail hierarchy has been established, having particular regard then to sort of the smaller end of the hierarchy, and this distinction then between neighbourhood centres and village centres or the villages in table 13, please.
Yes, good morning, Sharon Evans on behalf of Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. As you've noted, the council's response is set out in the statement, where we provide some background in relation to the retail hierarchy, the sort of centres hierarchy that's set out in policy ED8. Specifically in terms of the neighbourhood centres and the village settlements. Yes, the villages, as you rightly pointed out, have been informed by the role and function study, which was produced by the Borough Council. One of the elements that we have stated in our statement is that we think it would probably be appropriate to remove the word settlements. We think it should just be the villages. So just to make that clear. And the villages are defined by the limits to built development, and I think that's one of your other questions. In terms of the neighbourhood centres, they're generally areas of existing provision within the urban area. So you'll see those listed in Table 13. There's Hawkenbury, High Brooms, Knightswood, so etc. listed in that area. So they're generally sort of clusters of facilities within the urban area that serve that sort of local neighbourhood centre role. They've usually got sort of a range of community facilities and sort of smaller retail services and other facilities. So they are different, and that's why they're the same sort of level in the hierarchy, but listed separately.
Yes, obviously you've suggested the deletion of the word settlements. Do you think that the policy would be effective with that change? And do you think it would be confusing? Obviously, this is a retail policy and it's setting out the settlements and the retail hierarchy. Do you think it could be quite confusing then if it set out the retail hierarchy in terms of obviously your regional town centre, which is Royal Tunbridge Wells, then the town centres, then the rural service centres and neighbourhood centres, and then listed these villages, because presumably they don't have sort of boundaries or anything like that. Do you think that could be confusing?
I think when you consider the plan as a whole, obviously turning on to some of the other policies within this section, policy ED9 is clear that the policy approach there is applicable to the town and rural service centres. And then obviously policy ED12, which is retention of local services and facilities, that would apply to those neighbourhood village centres. So I think when considering the policies together, it's clear, but possibly some more commentary in the supporting text would help to explain that a little bit better.
Yeah, and on this on the strategy day, we talked about some changes, didn't we? To it was one of the SDR policies. I can't quite recall which one.
Yeah.
I think what the submitted plan doesn't quite do is, and it's how we discussed previously. It doesn't quite have that sort of, if you like, sort of strategy element where it says, these are our settlements. And this is the strategy, and then this is very much a different issue. This is about retail, and it's about retail hierarchy. So I think what you could do here is just make it clear that yes, you've got this hierarchy which goes obviously Royal Tunbridge Wells down, and then these are villages, and obviously you're listing your villages, but just making it clear then that they don't presumably have any. There's no sort of retail, primary shopping areas, retail centre boundaries, any of that. These are just essentially the remainder of the villages, and we'll come on to talk about what the policies do, but presumably they sort of would support proportionate new services and facilities, local shop, that sort of thing. Yeah.
And also in our response to your question too, at paragraph 15, we refer to the fact that we're looking at how best to provide a settlement hierarchy, as discussed at that previous session.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Sounds like what needs changing. So in terms of the hierarchy, then, obviously, Royal Tunbridge Wells at the top. For the remainder of the settlements then in the retail hierarchy, so obviously Cranbrook, Paddock, Southborough, and then we go into Hawkhurst and then neighbourhood centres.
Yeah.
Does that reflect the existing plan for the area? Presumably that's set out in the core strategy. And if not, are there any changes? Or is it just sort of continuation of the existing local plan?
Yes, I think again, as we've explained, the centres are so well defined and established. They were previously defined within the core strategy. So in reviewing the core strategy and the hierarchy, we've had further evidence-based documents that have informed the local plan. So that would include the Retail and Leisure Study 2017 and the update in 2021. And they did consider, in the main, the key centres, what we've sort of called the key centres of Royal Tunbridge Wells, Cranbrook, Paddock, Southborough and Hawkhurst, and it's carried out a reassessment of the health of those centres, the provision and their appropriateness. So we've sought to carry on that hierarchy as it is. In terms of the neighbourhood centres and the village centres, again, as set out in our statement at paragraph 13, we've reviewed those also, and there are some changes that have been made, and that's set out in our statement in terms of the deletion of a couple of the neighbourhood centres, and also the addition of neighbourhood centres, and that's set out there as well.
In terms of the hierarchy then, there was picking up a couple of points on the representations. What's the justification for Southborough then as a town centre? So we talked previously about sort of the role and function of Southborough and its relationship to Royal Tunbridge Wells in particular. What's its justification in the hierarchy as a town centre? Also, it's quite high up, second only behind Royal Tunbridge Wells.
Yes, so Southborough does operate, even though proximity to Royal Tunbridge Wells, it does operate as a separate town centre. It has a good range of services and facilities, has a small supermarket, a parade of shops. It has a town council. So in reviewing the hierarchy, it was considered that it did still perform the function of a town centre, albeit a small town centre.
And then within the hierarchy, so you've got Paddock Wood, which is defined as a town centre, and then you've also got as an asterisk under neighbourhood centres, where you've got within Paddock Wood and East Capel. So just talk to me about that then. Is that presumably, obviously we've talked at length about the strategic sites at Paddock Wood, is that the sort of smaller neighbourhood centre as part of those mixed use developments, which is obviously then reflected in ED8, presumably?
Yeah, just referring to my colleague, Mrs. Young, who'll come back on that one.
Morning, Hannah Young, Strategic Sites and Delivery Team Leader. So to confirm, under neighbourhood centres and number 11, that does refer to the 3 neighbourhood or local centres being proposed around the strategic growth as through STR SS1. So it specifically includes those 3 proposed neighbourhood centres.
In terms of Tudor Village, so Paddock Wood, does it mean neighbourhood centres there as part of that strategic site? Tudor Village as well, but it also says Tudor Village, which is expected to include a village centre as well as a number of neighbourhood centres. So just talk to me about what the difference is then. You think it's going to be clear to people what's expected in terms of its sort of role and function in retail terms? So
we have been reflecting upon this since the submission of the plan in terms of the quantum of floor space at Tudor Village, and as set out on the previous sessions, in total, Tudor Village will be looking at around 10,000 square metres of commercial and office floor space, comparable, as we discussed, with settlements such as Cranbrook, and we discussed how we thought that was appropriate given the scale of development and how we're seeking to create a sustainable new settlement. So on that basis, we consider now that it potentially would be appropriate for Chudley to perhaps sit under as a rural service centre alongside Hurkhurst, given the scale of development. And I think that was something that was noted by CPRE as well in their Regulation 19 representations, and we are minded to agree with that. The smaller parades or neighbourhood centres, as you'll see from the Chudley Village delivery strategy that was submitted by the Hadlow Estate at Reg 19, they are looking to provide a sort of village centre, and that's where the majority of the floor space will be going. That's over 6,000 square metres of floor space to that village centre, and then they're looking at 3 smaller neighbourhood centres to complement that and to provide the sort of your pint of milk and loaf of bread type shopping. So those could then retain within the neighbourhood centre as per number 11 with Paddock Wood, but we think overall the main village centre should be a rural service centre.
But in terms of, and again, this is something we've touched upon on previous sessions, in terms of the scale of development then, obviously again, you refer to 10,000 square metres, that's a significant amount of floor space, and like you say, is sort of comparable with Cranbrook, which is much higher in the settlement hierarchy. What's that based on there? What work has been done to consider what type of uses that will entail? So we talked on other days, didn't we, about trying to avoid a policy which essentially would be, the sort of large supermarket comes along and the council sort of not really got the control over this vision that it wanted at the earlier stage. So just talk to me a bit more about then what the scale of development and the sort of mix of uses are going to be expected there, and where does this sort of figure come from?
So the figure has stemmed from ongoing discussions with the Hadlow Estate in drawing up the master plan that has informed the overall policy for Chudley Village, and also it's been progressed further and is set out in the delivery strategy, and has been sense checked, if you like, for want of a better term, with the other settlements in the borough as referred to at Chudley Village, so Cranbrook, and looking at the GODE figures for Cranbrook for both retail and other commercial uses within the settlement. And as we've set out, we've been clear that we want Chudley Village to be a sustainable new settlement. We want to seek to enable the internalisation of trips as per the garden settlement principles. So we have sought to ensure the mix of uses and create the village centre. So it provides for that. And I think in terms of then future control of the scale of retail uses and the size of units, that would then be at the sort of development management stage in terms of the grant of planning permission and conditioning it accordingly. The policy sets out what's anticipated, and when we've discussed the range of uses that includes, shops, services, employment of an appropriate scale. So that is included within the policy wording. So we think the policy parameters provide the framework, and then the actual size and type can be controlled through development management process.
Also, we talked previous sessions, haven't we, about the whole rationale for Chudley Village and sort of seeking to internalisation of trips, sustainable development, etc., etc. Do you think at this scale of retail and commercial floor space, and sort of having it higher in the hierarchy, reflecting that as a sort of rural service centre, do you think there would then be that would become a sort of destination in its own right, to sort of potentially sort of go beyond just serving the needs of local residents to sort of drawing in trade from elsewhere, be it services, retail, jobs, etc.? Do you think there'd be a sort of a danger that it would sort of almost go too far and then start, drawing in sort of trade and people from elsewhere?
We don't, given the assessment we've done of the comparable settlements, and given the discussions and formation of the master plan. But I would refer you, and I haven't got the supporting text in front of me, but there's a paragraph, and I can find you the reference if shortly, within the supporting text of the Chudley Village proposals, that does sort of suggest that at planning application stage we would want to see evidence that the proposals and the village centre and the neighbourhood centres would not detract from the vitality and viability in impact terms of nearby town centres, so predominantly Paddock Wood and Tunbridge.
Okay, yeah, and in terms of Julie, we talked, didn't we, about sort of refinement of the policy, just to be clear exactly what's being proposed. Okay, so is that a modification that the council wish for me to recommend then? So it'd be the recommendation to amend the hierarchy to reflect Chudley Village then as not a neighbourhood centre but as a rural service centre.
It is, yes.
Okay, let's take some comments on this, but also just on the hierarchy itself. Then obviously I'll ask some questions about Southbury in particular, but others as well. We'll go to Margaret Borland. Ms. Borland first, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Margaret Borland, representing CPRE Kent, the Countryside Charity. I'm very, very pleased to hear that the council have taken up our suggestion that the Chudley Village Centre is not a village centre. It's at least a rural service centre. The one question that comes out of that, though, is do you actually need up to 3 neighbourhood centres within Chudley Village as well? If you concentrate all the development in all the retail development in one centre, surely Chudley Village will fit within the 20-minute neighbourhood, and therefore you wouldn't actually need to have the other neighbourhood centres. Yeah, the size of it physically, I don't think would warrant them. They would just be a detractor from that central retail area. It can't be more than 20 minutes walk even from the edge of that development to where the central area will be. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so just sticking with that point, it's a good point, isn't it? Realistically, these are the neighbourhood centres. Are they going to be centres, or is it just going to be like you say, a sort of local shop for your pint of milk and loaf of bread? What does the council envisage, and do you think that Chudley Village could actually sort of sustain that sort of number of different centres, or like Ms. Borland said, would developers and occupiers not just be reliant upon this sort of main village centre?
I think it's appropriate to allow for the smaller neighbourhood centres to provide those top-up shopping facilities. So, you're looking at a new settlement where you have your village heart, and that's where the primary school is going to go. That's where the village centre is going to go. The nursery, the other community facilities around a village green. That's in the centre of Chudley Village, around Bank Farm, and then this is all being provided by one master developer, and what they're seeking to do is not detract then from that village centre. That would still be the heart, but it would be to provide the opportunities for residents to walk 5 minutes down the road to get their pint of milk and their loaf of bread, and the sort of the day-to-day top-up shopping facilities, rather than visiting the village centre. And it brings a sense of community, and it shapes that place even more. So those living on the periphery have somewhere closer to go than in the centre, and they have through the discussions we've had and through their master planning work, provided confidence to us that this would create a sense of the right way to create a sense of place, and it meets the garden settlement principles. And we think the policy, it doesn't require 3 neighbourhood centres, it just allows for up to 3 neighbourhood centres along with the village centre. And I think it would then be through, as referred to, the development management process for us to ensure that that's planned correctly and is in the appropriate location and doesn't act as a outside of the how it should act, so as outside of the top-up shopping parade or day-to-day services. We're talking about shopping, but there are other forms of uses that form the neighbourhood parades. It can be commercial, office, workshops. They might be a small neighbourhood parade of workshops with a small retail element. So I think we're looking at the bigger picture, and it's not just your corner shops anymore, it's the wider commercial uses, but it's to serve the residents of the settlement. And we could look at as you know, we're looking at the policy wording for Tudor Village, and we can tighten that in that respect to make clear that it's to serve the community, and that's to serve the residents of that community.
Okay, thank you. Go to John Herbert next, please.
Thank you very much, sir. John Herbert, Troy Planning for Paddock Wood Town Council. Just to touch on the inclusion of Paddock Wood in the list of neighbourhood centres. And I think the issue for the Town Council there is the actual definition of a neighbourhood centre and what is expected in these places. And we don't think it's entirely clear from the local plan what is expected. The supporting text to policy ED8 at para 6.511 refers to a mix of type of uses that might be included in a neighbourhood centre. And then later on in the same chapter at para 6.534, I think it is, there's reference to neighbourhood centres being defined as clusters of a minimum of 5 community buildings and facilities. Which potentially sounds quite a lot actually for a neighbourhood centre. I think that clarity then needs to be read and linked back to the wider strategic policy for Paddock Wood at SS1, where clause 2B effectively says up to 2,000 square metres of floor space, or approximately 2,000 square metres of floor space, will be provided in the neighbourhood centres, but doesn't actually then extend beyond that to say what we're actually expecting each centre and what their role and function will be. And I think the concern there is the work on the growth areas is deferred to master plans and SPDs, but if plan applications come forward ahead of those, or master plans don't come forward together, all of that growth might go in one neighbourhood centre, the first one, or it might not be balanced proportionally across the area, and therefore those neighbourhood centres might not actually provide for the day-to-day needs of the community in which they're intended to be. Or it might be that you have one larger centre that starts impacting on the role and function of Paddock Wood Town Centre. So I think there's a need for some more clarity as to what a neighbourhood centre really is in the context of Paddock Wood. Thank you.
Yeah, so just on that then, so does the plan then seek to provide a definition as to what a neighbourhood centre might look like?
I think just referring to the local plan and the paragraphs that Mr. Herbert just referred to, as he said, at 6.511, it's essentially saying that neighbourhood centres perform the role of local centres with day-to-day facilities, and it does list those type of facilities that may be included. And then at 6.532, it sets out, again, what local facilities may be, range of services, and there's a list there of what they may include. In terms of 6.534, clusters of minimum 5 community facilities. You know, I think it's sort of recognising that within the urban areas there are these clusters of facilities, and it's seeking to protect those. You know, for the local community. You know, it means there's facilities that are local to people, they can walk to them, and I think, you know, we don't want to be too prescriptive in terms of, you know, exactly the uses and in a set area, but it's recognising that there are those clusters, and that's what are recognised in table 13. And so, you know, it could be, you know, as there often are, you know, you get a primary school, and there might be a shop and church, you know, community halls and buildings, and GP surgeries. So I think it is clear when you look across the different paragraphs. But again, if it's felt that we need to be a bit clearer, we can do that. I mean, possibly we could add a bit more information within the supporting text to policy ED8 of what's considered to be neighbourhood centres, so that it's in one place without having to refer to the different paragraphs within the chapter.
Obviously, you have some of the detail, don't you, about the Paddock Wood sites, the eastern parcel, isn't it, that sort of progressed. And we've heard on previous days how the developers there have sort of progressed with detail. So what's that sort of pre-application work showing? Is this sort of bearing fruit, so to speak? Then is this what's coming out of the master planning work, or is it actually the developers trying to seek to do something different?
No, it's not. It's reflective of the master planning work, as alluded to. All the site promoters are working towards the structure plan that David Locke Associates prepared. I just refer you to the point 2B of the Paddock Wood policy, STR SS1, which it does say 3 neighbourhood centres, 1 in each of the key development parcels, as outlined on map 27. And identifies it. So we've got the policy provision to enable that to be stated, so it won't be that there's just one massive large format supermarket in one of the units. There will be a requirement for that in each of the western and the eastern parcels. Specifically with East Paddock Wood, they are looking at around 700 square metres of floor space. It's going to come forward as phase 2, and they're going to be submitting a hybrid application. So that's going to be full planning permission for phase 1 and outline for phase 2. So as you can anticipate, at the moment, it's going to be fairly flexible in terms of the range of uses for that phase 2 to then be determined through the reserve matters for that stage, but will be conditioned accordingly to make sure that it's units, you know, the unit size is restricted, so that it can't, you know, it's appropriate for the scale of to serve the purposes to serve, and that's as a local centre to serve the needs of the local residents. So we think that the policy provision and framework will enable that development management decision to be made accordingly.
Okay, we'll go to Dr. Whitbourne, who's got his hand up, please.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you. So happy to continue. Coming through loud and clear.
Trying to get a picture as well. Anyway, well, my name, I haven't spoken before at this hearing. My name is Dr. Philip Whitbourne. I've lived in. Oh, can you find me the picture? No, I'm meant to be speaking.
Chris, I'm not sure if you can through.
I have a technical man who's trying to get my picture.
Yeah, I'm looking at trying to get his video working, but I think he's got someone alongside. It should be coming up now. It's showing as video.
Sorry.
That's okay. We can hear you if you do want to carry on. We can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Well, I'm happy to do that. What I wanted to do was to pick up on the hierarchy and what was being said about Royal Tunbridge Wells and Southborough in particular. I entirely agree, of course, that Royal Tunbridge Wells is indeed rightly identified as the primary shopping, leisure, cultural and tourist destination in the borough. And that makes it very different from the other more local centres of Cranbrook and Paddock Wood and Southborough. Yet, it seems to me that two things flow from that. One is that when you go back to page 3 of the plan that talks about vision and objectives, if indeed you think there should be a vision in the plan, which I personally do, all you find is Southborough and Royal Tunbridge Wells lumped together with a local aspiration to maintain their role as the main urban area, which they can hardly fail to do in a borough that is largely AN, OP and Greenbelt, and with villages and small town centres. It's bound to be the main urban area. It's not a local ambition at all. And I feel strongly that Royal Tunbridge Wells, as a major regional centre and a major historic town, should have its own local ambitions of maintaining and enhancing its primary regional role as the shopping, leisure, cultural and tourist destination that should be separate from any local ambitions that are appropriate to Southborough. The other point that I would make arising from this distinction, it concerns the very important, I think, forthcoming town centre area plan, which talks about, rightly, ensuring vitality and viability. Those obviously are important. They'd be just as important in Southborough or Paddock Wood or anywhere else. But that is not enough of a brief for the very important forthcoming town centre plan, which also needs to have a framework to ensure Tunbridge Wells as the primary regional centre, a major historic town in Kent, and a tourist destination. So those, although I agree, of course, with Royal Tunbridge Wells' role as the primary centre, regional centre in the borough, that I make those 2 points that flow from that.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Claire Riley next, please.
Good morning, Claire Riley on behalf of Paddock Wood Town Council. Paddock Wood Town Council has concerns that the quite large number and quite a lot of square footage of the neighbourhood centres, both in the Paddock Wood sites and also in the Tootley Village Centre, will risk the sustainability of Paddock Wood Town Centre and its current retail outlets. It's difficult to determine without more specific detail which on what will be in these neighbourhood centres, which isn't really included in the plan. It's difficult to determine what effect this is going to have on our current retail. The other point is there's references in the neighbourhood centres to community facilities. We're currently building a community centre in Paddock Wood. We've spent the last several years spending an enormous amount of consultation and effort to demonstrate the need for this, despite the fact that there's already been a 25 to 30% increase in the population of Paddock Wood, with incremental smaller developments plus the 3 major developments that are under construction at the moment. So I'm not actually sure how much need, how they're going to demonstrate what need there is for that in the neighbourhood centres. The other thing is that the master planning work by David Locke that we've seen so far has shown the town centre effectively being moved to the north of the railway line, mainly due to the fact that there isn't sufficient land in and around the current town centre to actually do some more redevelopment and add some more retail. And there's no clear demonstration that we can see of how connectivity between the current town as it exists, which is predominantly south of the railway line, and that area to the north of the railway line will be achieved. There's currently one narrow road, Maidstone Road, which runs across the railway bridge, which is literally got one pedestrian footpath and is quite narrow. And there's the only footbridge, which doesn't work for cycle paths or anything like that, is the one that runs across from the station. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to achieve the connectivity between that, what looks like moving the town centre to the north of the railway line, and the town where it exists now. And as I say, we're also concerned about the current retail and how it will survive. If it's all very well saying they're just going to go and buy a pint of milk and a loaf of bread, but if the town centre loses any more retail, then you also risk the fact that perhaps Waitrose might go and then your town centre's gone. So that's the primary concern we have as regards to the neighbourhood centres, and that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so just on that, and we'll obviously allow the council to come back on some of the other points that have been raised, but just on that consideration, it goes back to sort of scale of sort of retail and commercial uses that are proposed at Tudor Village. The retail, commercial and leisure town centre uses study update, that looked, didn't it, at the sort of capacity for new retail facilities as part of new strategic developments, and within there it looked at convenience and comparison capacity. It looked at a number of households proposed at Tudor Village, population size, expenditure, etc., etc. It sort of came to the conclusion that there'd be I think it said about 2,000 square meters of convenience retail capacity. What work has the council done then to consider likely impacts on places like Paddock Wood with this higher amount of floor space that's proposed at Tudor Village? Or is it intended that actually it wouldn't be main town centre uses, it would be more the sort of employment aspect?
Sorry. So yes, in terms of Tudor, the Nexus retail study did provide a sort of quantum of floor space of around 2,000 square meters, which was just retail. And I think it's useful to confirm that these floor space figures are just A1 retail as they were. And obviously with local centres, you would have far more than that. And the 10,000 square metre floor space that is referred to at Tudor Village also includes your offices as well. So that includes retail, leisure, commercial and office uses. We, for reasons that we stated in previous sessions, and as noted by Nexus itself in the retail study, that it's when you're planning for new settlements, it's not necessarily just a sort of applying your standard formulas because you're looking to retain and create a new settlement. It's not just an expansion where there's existing facilities, and you need to create that sense of place. And as mentioned earlier on in this session, that we sense checked that against the other comparable size settlements within the borough. I think through today's discussions, and as mentioned, that the Tudor Village policy in terms of the local centre and village centre would benefit from perhaps a stronger use of term of, that this is to serve the new settlements only, rather than attracting expenditure from elsewhere. And we can certainly would want to do that, and we can do that, and then that would allow the development management process to control that accordingly. And we've, as I said, alluded to it was para 5.222 was a paragraph I couldn't remember earlier, which does set out that would then need to be through the planning application, that issue addressed. So we were comfortable with that.
Okay, finally, Ms. Ball, and then we'll sort of come back to council and any other points they want to wrap up on.
Thank you, sir. Margaret Ball from CPRE again. I just wanted to highlight that all the neighbourhood centres listed currently under ED8 as existing, so ignoring Paddock Wood, East Capel and Tudley Village, all of those are within the main urban area. So primarily Royal Tunbridge Wells, with definitely one in Southborough, and I'm never sure with High Brooms whether it's the bit that's in Southborough or the bit that's in Royal Tunbridge Wells. But basically, they're all within the main urban area, and suddenly we're moving the whole neighbourhood centres out to completely different types of area. So I'm very, very supportive of Mr. Herbert's point that we need some clarity about what these neighbourhood centres are going to deliver, because we're now putting them in places that are outside the main urban area for the very first time. Thank you.
Okay, and finally back to the council. Any points just done on this issue before we move on?
And I just come back firstly to Dr. Whitbourne's reference to Royal Tunbridge Wells and Southborough. I just wanted to clarify that there are separate strategies and visions for the two separate centres. So I just draw your attention to policy STR RTW1, which is the strategy for Royal Tunbridge Wells, policy STR RTW2, which is the strategy for Royal Tunbridge Wells Town Centre, and then policy STR SO1, which is the strategy for Southborough. So, and I know he referred to them being considered together, some references in the earlier section of the plan in the vision, but I just wanted to make it clear that there are separate strategies and visions for those centres when you read the plan as a whole. And then also coming back on the neighbourhood centre point raised by Mrs. Borland, I think I'd just draw your attention to the wording at policy ED8 in terms of the beginning section of that policy, to ensure the long-term vitality and viability across the borough. It just sets that out, and development should be appropriate to the size and function of the centre within which it is to be located. So I think it's clear there that the amount of development that would be appropriate within those neighbourhood centres, that's clearly set out in that policy.
Okay, thank you very much. So we looked at the sort of hierarchy of various centres, and sort of moving, there's the retail discussion on there. Sort of this comes on to sort of issue 2, so it's about managing these centres then. So sort of issue 2 is about managing vitality and viability of these centres, and the first 2 questions sort of sit comfortably together then. So firstly, does the local plan set out the need for sort of commercial, leisure and town centre uses over the plan period? And so that's the first part of the question, so sort of setting the need. And then secondly, does the plan allocate a range of suitable sites to meet those needs? And if not, why not? Okay.
Referring back to the statement that was submitted on behalf of the council, and in terms of, as you said, your question 1 and 2 in terms of the vitality and viability and forecast needs. I think we set out in quite some detail in the statement the work that has been carried out to inform the local plan. We consider that it's in accordance with paragraph 86 of the NPPF. We've had 2 evidence-based documents prepared. So there was the 2017 Retail and Leisure Study. There was also the Town Centre Office Market Review 2018. I think it's important to note that obviously things have changed since the 2017 retail study, particularly in terms of retailing, town centre uses and sort of the high street. So we considered it was prudent to update that work. And so the 2021 study, which was broader in its scope, considering retail, commercial, leisure and town centre uses, that was updated to inform the Reg 19 local plan. And I think a particular note is paragraph 17 of the statement, where we refer to the findings of that 2021 study and whether it's appropriate to allocate sites to meet needs identified. And I think I draw your attention to the conclusions of that work, where there is some identified capacity from convenience floor space, but not comparison. But it was considered that it's not appropriate to allocate sites specifically to meet that need. We're keen to protect the town centres. There's recognition that there's existing vacant floor space within the town centre, and it's not been considered appropriate to allocate new specific sites to meet the small amount of need that was identified. The council has looked at strategies in terms of how to support the town centre, particularly in relation to Royal Tunbridge Wells town centre. And you'll see reference in there to the town centre local plan that the council has commenced work on. So I think we set out quite clearly in the statement how we're seeking to meet the needs of the town centre over the plan period. The statement does also, at paragraph 32 on page 11, we have identified where there are some sites that are allocated within the local plan, and also reference to the strategic policies also, which I've also mentioned previously for Royal Tunbridge Wells and Southborough, but those strategic policies for the other centres as well.
So in terms of the need, does the local plan set out what the need is for the various uses then? Presumably it might potentially in the supporting text somewhere.
Yes, yeah, there's reference in the earlier sections of the plan where it talks about the overall strategy. And then that's also taken forward with further information provided within the section 6 in terms of the development management policies, what the approach is, but also set out within the various place shaping policies as well.
So, okay, it's probably something for me to sort of go away and look at a bit more in detail then, but I think generally that the sort of messages that you set out in your hearing statement and the rationale for, you've identified certainly the sort of convenience shopping needs, but then you sort to justify why you haven't, for example, allocated a single site, and that's all set out in your hearing statements, and the Nexus report refers to that as well. It's just making sure that then that's clear to users of the plan. So maybe just have a look at the supporting text. To be honest, it may be in there, and so it may not need a change. But if it's not, then I think we'll be looking to sort of change the plan just to sort of emphasise and make that point clear.
Yeah, I'll just double check the reference in the earlier section of the plan. I can provide that to you. Yeah.
So in terms of the convenience needs, then obviously the Nexus study referred to a sort of capacity for new convenience retailing. how would you talked about sort of Royal Tunbridge Wells sort of new local plan that's coming forward and the area action plan, etc. How actually will these needs be met then? What will happen to meet these needs in the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years then? Or what does the council aspire or hope will happen in the next 5, 10 years to actually sort of address these needs then?
Yeah, I think again, I draw your attention to our statements where we refer to that, and I think even though there is some capacity identified, the council is keen to protect the town centre, and so there are, as I said, there are vacant units within the centre, and it's hoped that further need would be provided for within those town centre sites. There are possibilities for extension of existing units or repurposing of other units within that centre, rather than making a standalone allocation for a new convenience store, which often convenience retailers want to locate sort of edge of centre, out of centre locations. So I think the council is keen that further provision is provided for within the town centres.
And if this strategy doesn't work, obviously you've got the town centre AAP that's sort of on the horizon. But if this doesn't work, what sort of then for the council? What options would be open to the council if this strategy didn't work? So sort of retailers sort of continued to maybe sort of turn the back on the town centre, changing trends, etc., etc. What would the council do then?
I guess the council would have to consider any proposals that came forward for uses. If they couldn't be met in the town centre, the council would need to consider those. Also, the work being undertaken as part of the town centre area plan, we'll be looking again at the sort of requirements for retail needs over the plan period. So, I mean, obviously that's specific to Tunbridge Wells Town Centre, but that work we'll look again at what the retail needs are over the longer term, and that can be fed into any sort of review of the local plan, but also within the town centre local plan. There are sites that are being considered as part of that work, and so the council can continue to consider that.
Just remind me of the timescales for that plan then?
Yeah, work has commenced on the town centre local plan. There is a working group set up which meet monthly to discuss the town centre plan. Consultants have been commissioned to start work on that in terms of master planning. In terms of the overall timescales that's set out within the local development scheme, I can just check the we're looking to go out to issues and options consultation in summer next year, and we can provide, it's set out in the local development scheme, the timescales going beyond that.
Okay, let's have some views on this then. We'll go to Peter Waldron, please, who's got his hand up.
Yes, sir. Peter Waldron from Carney Sweeney, acting on behalf of Aberdeen, formerly Standard Life. Just a quick point, really. We spoke last week on the employment session about the need to redraft and rephrase, I think it was ED 12, to clarify the reference to retail and leisure in that policy that it currently stands. And I'm just wondering to what degree has the amount of retail that the council are proposing on those employment sites been taken into account in their retail strategy, because those employment allocations relate to a sizable quantum of land, in the borough. At the moment, the policy doesn't talk about quantum of retail or leisure floor space, it just talks about the uses. Is there a need in the redrafting of that policy to actually put in some size limits? And if not, has that quantum of space been considered in terms of retail and leisure needs, of which there appears to be precious little other than some convenience need?
When you refer to size limits, what do you mean, and to which policy?
I think it was ED12, sir, that we were talking about.
Sorry, can I just come in? It was policy ED1 at the session last Thursday. Can I come back on that now? Yeah, I think just to clarify, the policy ED1 was the designation of the key employment areas, and we had the discussion about the range of uses that should be listed as being appropriate within those key employment areas. And I think it's just important to note that there weren't allocations, there is a designation. So there's no floor space apportioned to those in terms of those town centre, leisure type uses that we discussed at that session. So there wouldn't be any need for any further sort of consideration of that in terms of them not being not being there but somewhere else, because they weren't allocations, it was a designation of those areas.
Yeah, and we talked about the wording, didn't we, and emphasising the fact that these were, essentially sort of small scale, sort of ancillary uses that were sort of, serving the key emphasis of the key employment area, and it was trying to make sure that the policy moved away from any inference that there would somehow be, further retail and leisure uses supported there.
That really is my point, sir, that I understand from the discussion last week that the intention is for small scale ancillary uses. And I'm just really making the point that in the redrafting of that policy, it would seem to be sensible to quantify what that means. Or if not, you might get larger, or possibly large proposals coming forward, which would be in accordance with policy ED1, and yet would work against the retail strategy, potentially, either individually or collectively across all of those sites.
I don't think you need to start specifying precise floor space figures. I think there needs to be some sort of consideration of, that's what the development management process is for. I think in terms of redrafting the policy, it can be made abundantly clear, what it means without getting dragged into setting arbitrary floor space requirements for individual uses. Ms. Borland?
Thank you, sir. Again, Margaret Borland speaking on behalf of CPRE Kent. In our representations, we've highlighted that we think there should be the potential for more development, housing development within the town centre areas. The council have very clearly identified the changes that are going on both with retail and employment. And our view is that at the moment it's saying 150 to 200 additional residential units for the town centre as a target. That seems very low when you look at the potential that residential development would have now in terms of maintaining the viability of the town centre. There would be a lot of young people and probably older people who would be much happier living in very close walking distance to the retail, to the leisure, than actually living further out and having to drive into it. I will always walk to the local shops if I can, rather than going into the centre of Tunbridge Wells. So the housing development side of it seems to be a bit underplayed for us. Thank you.
Yes, this brings us on to policy ED9 then, which is really my question 3 about what sort of uses are then actually sort of permitted in. Obviously, you've had your hierarchy, you've got your town centres and rural service centres, etc. So policy ED9 then, so that's defined town and rural service centres. So is that intentionally different then from neighbourhood centres? Or is that a sort of intended sort of differentiation there?
Yes, so I think policy ED8 defines the hierarchy, including the town, rural service, neighbourhood centres and village centres. And then policy ED9 specifically defined town and rural service centres. So it's the policy that's applying to those town and rural service centres, and as defined on the policies maps, and those centres are all defined within the inset maps. And so then the policy is set out there.
Okay, so if you had a proposal for something in the neighbourhood centre, then where would you go? Is there a separate policy on neighbourhood centres then?
Yes, you'd go to policy ED12.
Let's just have a quick look.
Although I guess, well, policy ED12 is really in relation to the retention of local services and facilities.
Yeah, it's more about that. You've maybe got a new development, be it a change of use, or something within neighbourhood centre. Where do you go to determine whether or not that's appropriate?
Well, policy ED8 does say development should be appropriate to the size and function of the centre within which it's located. So and then that they're listed there. So I guess a combination of the two in terms of proposals for new uses in those, and then retention of the existing would be in policy ED12.
It's whether or not you expand ED9 and put a paragraph in just to make it abundantly clear. Then obviously you've got these neighbourhood centres and what we talked about previously. The types of things that you're looking to support. It's the sort of smaller scale. Main town centre uses that are proportionate to the role and function of the neighbourhood centre, serving the local community for their day-to-day needs, etc.
Yeah.
The
last sentence of policy ED9 does say actually development proposals within the defined centres should be of an appropriate scale in accordance with its functional position in the hierarchy set out in policy ED8. So maybe essentially it's the title that that needs amending.
I think it just you sort of pick up the plan and think, okay, neighbourhood centres, where do we go? And it's maybe just making policy ED9 clearer then that it's referring to the centres in ED8 essentially, isn't it? And that's why ED8 needs changing, because those villages don't have centres. So they're villages for the purposes of your strategy. They have limits to built development. But they don't have, when we're talking specifically about retail policies, they don't have a defined town centre boundary.
No.
The other centres do. And the other change as well, which I picked up on in the MIQs, and you sort of, I think, agreed with in your response, was the change to or change from appropriate uses. So I think you mean main town centre uses there for the retail purposes.
Yeah, and we recommended a change to reflect that.
Just on Ms. Borland's point about residential as well, then presumably the council would sort of support residential sort of flats above shops, etc. Would they?
Yeah, and I think Mrs. Borland was referring specifically to policy STR RTW2, the strategy for Alton Wales Town Centre, and at bullet point 8 at the bottom of there, it refers to increased residential development as part of the appropriate mix of uses within the town centre to ensure a vibrant and viable centre. So in addition to those sites which already have planning permission or are subject to detailed allocations, and I would draw attention to the phrase at least 150 to 200 additional residential units will be provided in the town centre. So that's set out within the strategic policy. But then also, it is permissible within the policies ED9 in terms of you know, sort of main town centre uses, but obviously other uses that add to the vitality and viability of the town centre, and that's very much reflected in the policy approach.
So just under ED9 then, if the policy supported main town centre uses, do you think ED9 or any other policy should be more explicit then that residential uses, you know, above shops and other commercial uses would be, because I think the framework specifically talks about this, doesn't it, in terms of making it's under the sort of the efficient and effective use of land chapter. I think it talks about this sort of maximizing opportunities, and obviously goes right back to sort of earlier days of this sort of process where we talked about densities and maximizing urban areas, etc. So I just wonder whether the plan just needs to be explicit then that because this is about all centres, isn't it? Not just roads.
Yeah,
that
I think also moving on a bit, but to policy ED11, which is the primary shopping areas and retail frontages policy, the final sentence, the final sort of paragraph of that policy does refer to changes of use to residential at first floor in such locations would be supported and encouraged, subject to conformity with other policies in the local plan. And we'll come on to this policy, I'm sure, but you know, the council is seeking to protect sort of retail, commercial, you know, sort of main town centre uses at the ground floor, to provide that sort of active frontage at street level, but you know, is accepting that actually residential above in town centre locations would be supported.
I think I try to avoid modifications like this because it does result in some repetition, but I think ED9 is probably quite a logical place because ED11 is about primary shopping areas and retail frontages, so there may be other opportunities within town centres that aren't in your primary shopping area where clearly, you know, if a developer wanted to sort of 3-story building and support some flats above, then it sounds sort of pretty much that the council would support that. So
so some reference within policy ED9 to the support of residential.
It is part of I think Ms. Borland's right, isn't it? It's part of the overall sort of vibrancy of the town centre. The framework reflects that as well. So that was question 3 about sort of mix of uses. In ED9, we sort of talked about some changes. So ED10 then, so this is more about use of sort of sequential and local impact test. And again, just in terms of the terminology, I think in your statement you've reflected a potential modification that's required here, just to make sure that the wording in terms of main town centre uses, etc., is correct. It's essentially, I think what you need to do is just have a sort of a look through the retail policies and just check against the framework, where the framework talks about main town centre uses, and then it also talks about sequential tests, and then for impact tests it's slightly different. So it's just making sure that the terminology throughout the plan and the supporting text is correct, essentially, and consistent with national planning policy. I think there's just a sort of couple of instances. The one we've just talked about was a sort of example of that. So looking at Ms. Borland, got your hand up.
Sorry, very quick question. Could ED10 also include some references to heritage? Because a lot of the primary shopping areas and so on within the borough are within conservation sites particularly, and we feel that heritage should be a factor within the sequential and local impact tests. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the problem there is that it's all you end up where do you stop, and suddenly everything becomes of relevance. Obviously, residential amenities and other sort of key aspect of that. So I think whilst important planning material considerations, there's probably enough within the other policies in the plan to sort of consider those. those impacts. So looking at the two issues then, the sequential test and the local impact test, obviously all these requirements are set out in national planning policy, and that's where the council's policies are sort of founded on. One of the questions I did ask was about essentially sort of disaggregation, or sort of where a developer has to look at sequentially preferable in-centre sites, the type of units that they should look at though. And I think this is in the supporting text at paragraph 6.525. So it says here, applicants will be expected to have demonstrably followed a sequential approach when selecting development sites for town centre uses, including fully exploring how the scheme could be adapted so it could be accommodated on a more central site. And then you've sort of defined that. So this is disaggregation or operating from a number of units within the defined centre rather than a single unit. So for those who maybe aren't quite sort of affair with the retail planning world, so this is essentially a test within national planning policy then that states if you wish to seek to develop outside a town centre, so beyond the town centre boundaries, then you should look at sequentially preferable in-centre sites first. And what the plan is saying is when you do that process, when you're looking at available in-centre sites, you should consider operating from, potentially a number of smaller units rather than a single large unit and ruling out available sites. So what's the justification for this then? Where's that come from? And do you think it's consistent with the approach in national planning policy?
Okay, yeah. So in response to your question 5, our statements that pages 17, 18 deal with this issue, and we've referred you to the retail, commercial, leisure and town centre uses study update, and where it at paragraph 8.24 it suggests that policies consider flexible working practices and new formats, amalgamation, subdivision of existing town centre units, and workspace also. So I think we've included it within the supporting text, as you say, in terms of disaggregation, whether that's a possibility that a proposal could consider operating for a number of units within the centre rather than just from a single unit. That's not specifically referred to in the policy itself. The policy itself just refers to, just trying to find the reference. At 5, applicants should demonstrate flexibility on issues such as format and scale, and will be expected to provide the council with robust evidence of this. And I think it's just picking up that point. And we're aware there's sort of case law on this point in terms of the sort of disaggregation issue and whether that's appropriate or not. But I'm aware that there is sort of recent case in March 2022 where it was considered that could be, there could be some flexibility on that, and it would be a planning judgment to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. So we felt that it was appropriate to include that within the supporting text, so that could be considered as part of proposals coming forward.
Okay, Mr. Waldron.
It would have been helpful if the council had referred to the 2022 case in their hearing statement, but they haven't. I can't comment on that. What I am aware of is a lot of case law, including called-in applications, where the inspector has specifically said there's nothing in national policy to require disaggregation, and the Secretary of State has specifically endorsed that finding. I'm not aware of any case which the Secretary of State has endorsed anything to the contrary. It was once a controversial point shortly after the scrapping of PPS 4, I think it was, it's almost not controversial anymore. National policy does not require disaggregation. And I think whilst it's not in the policy, the reason justification for a policy cannot go further than the policy wording itself. And there's case law about that. So for my money, I just can't see how this paragraph in the RJ can remain.
Yeah, I tend to agree that the supporting text does go a bit further. I think point 5, point 5 in the policy is generally fine. That's, applicants should demonstrate flexibility on issues such as format and scale. And quite rightly that you'd ask applicants to provide that. It's this specific reference to disaggregation and operating from a smaller number of units within a town centre. I probably do share Mr. Waldron's concerns that this paragraph 6.525 would become almost a sort of policy requirement, and whether or not it does go too far, and whether actually there's just sufficient control afforded by 0.5 in the policy. Demonstrate flexibility on issues such as format and scale, because I think you're right, it comes down to case by case, doesn't it? It's consideration of the particular type of development proposal as to the likelihood of the sort of alternatives that can realistically be looked at.
I think that's right. So we need to maintain the flexibility. Oops. And I think we just take out the words in the brackets and parentheses. I don't think they're needed.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there's enough in the policy that would give the council, like I said, that there's enough there to give the council the sort of control at development management purposes to, if somebody hadn't appropriately considered suitable in-centre sites, then there's enough there for the council to.
Yeah, there certainly is, and it maintains consistency with the MPPF as well.
Yeah. Okay, jolly good. So that was sequential then. So the impact assessments, this is where a developer has to consider the impact of a development proposal. And so this is sort of the second half of policy ED 10. So local impact test. So within there, you set some thresholds then. So thresholds where these impact tests need to be carried out. Again, what are they based on? And do you think they're justified?
Again, I'd refer you to the evidence base that has informed the local plan, and the council statement sets that out on pages 19 and 20. This refers to the Retail and Leisure Study 2017, which initially looked at this and set the local thresholds, recommended the local thresholds to be applied within the local plan. That work was reconsidered in the 2021 update, and it was considered that those thresholds were still appropriate. So the justification for that is set out at paragraphs 9.50 to 9.65 of the 2017 study, and that considers a number of factors, including the average size of the units within the centres, and that's taken from the Experian Go plans, and sort of acknowledging that the units are relatively small in those across the borough, and then also looking at existing trading patterns. And essentially, that the council should set out a policy that seeks to protect town centres. So by applying a local impact test, it's considered that should do that. I think paragraph 9.59 of the 2017 study in particular, identifies that Royal Tunbridge Wells is sort of potentially vulnerable to small and medium-sized standalone retail proposals that could directly compete with the offer of the town centre. So it's considered 1,000 square metres would cover some of those sort of small to medium retail formats. who most sort of active in the market that you know, tend to prioritise outer centre and edge of centre locations. And by applying that that figure, then that would pick up such proposals and seek for them to carry out the impact test.
Yeah, okay, and that's set out in the supporting evidence. I think one change that is needed, and I think you've agreed and picked up on this, is that the phrase where there is a potential adverse impact, obviously that's the purpose of the impact assessment. So it's I think it's just deleting those phrases. You know, you've got a threshold, you're above that threshold, you provide the impact test. That then gives you the answer as to whether or not there'd be any potential adverse impacts.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah. Okay, any comments then on policy ED10? Obviously, it's quite a technical policy. I appreciate that. That reflects national planning policy then, which refers to this sort of sequential test and then a local impact test. Mr. Waldron?
Thank you, sir. Yes, I've got a couple of points, if I may. I think you asked the council to consider the wording so that it reflects the NPPF, and you noted that it's different wording in respect of the impact test than sequential test. So the NPF refers to retail and leisure in respect of the impact test, but the justification for this local threshold appears from my reading of the 2017 study and the paragraphs that Ms. Riley has referred to, is all on the basis of retail. So the 2017 study talks about the need for comparison and convenience goods. It talks about the retail market, retail capacity. It talks about standalone retail proposals in paragraph 9.59. At no point does it seem to be considering leisure. So it seems to me that if the council simply amended the policy ED10 to reflect the NPPF wording in respect of impact and related it to retail and leisure, I'm not sure that there's any justification for applying a local threshold for leisure. I have other points, but do you want me to pause there?
Okay, yeah, we'll go back to council on that, please.
Yeah, so as the policy is worded, it does apply to leisure uses as well. And I think even though the the justification for the policy and for the approach is set out within the 2017 study, as Mr. Waldron referred to, we felt it was appropriate and proportionate to apply the same threshold to leisure uses also. It's not considered necessary to apply it to office. It's on reflection, checking back through the NPPF, I don't think office should be included, so that we may need to make an amendment to the policy in that regard.
I think the point I'm making is why is it considered to be appropriate and proportionate if there's no evidence at all that looks at the need for it, let alone the level of the threshold in respect to leisure?
So obviously, is this a case then that in the council's judgment, the same issues apply insofar as retail and leisure, insofar as, you know, it's the nature of the town centre with these sort of typically smaller units. That's obviously a constraint of the history of the area and the type of place and the type of buildings that are there, and so it's these smaller units, and therefore in the council's sort of judgment, that's a reason why the threshold should be set lower than the threshold in the NPPF at 2,500 square metres to reflect the size, type and form of units that the town centre offers. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Waldron, the other points?
The other point relates to how it would work in practice. Obviously, the impact test applies when you're not in a centre, and yet we have a different threshold and I think the wording, as you pointed out, is now proposed to be changed. Different threshold for proposals above 1,000 square metres at Royal Tunbridge Wells, and 280 square metres at Southborough, etc. What does "at" mean in that context? And what if I was in an area, let's take Southborough as a good example because it is so close to Royal Tunbridge Wells. What if I was in an area sort of outside, as it would have to be at least edge, wouldn't it, for this threshold to apply, outside Southborough and outside Tunbridge Wells? Which threshold do I look to?
I'll let the council answer this, but my understanding of the policy would be that if you were considering impacts on Southborough, you'd be considering anything above 280. If you're considering impact on Royal Tunbridge Wells, you'd be considering anything over 1,000. So in your scenario, if you I don't know, let's pick a number, 500 square metres, then you'd be required to consider impact on Southborough, but not Royal Tunbridge Wells. But that was my reading of it, but I'll let the council
Yes.
tell me if I'm wrong.
Yes, no, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and then presumably, if you were, 1,500, and geographically, you were likely to have an impact on Southborough by reason of its proximity, geography, etc., then you'd be considering impacts on both centres.
Right. Okay. So this isn't to do. I'm just thinking that if the local threshold didn't apply, you might propose a 2,000 square metres proposal, and you wouldn't have to do an impact test at all. This local threshold is, just trying to think it through in my head, it's not really about whether you have to or whether you don't have to. It's as much about, if you are doing one, where you have to focus your attention. Because you could have a proposal, let's say, right on the edge of the borough for 800 square metres, far from Royal Tunbridge Wells, in truth, but you would still have to do a retail impact assessment, and you would have to consider the impact on Southborough, Paddock Wood, Cranbrook and Hawkhurst.
Yeah, I think it would only be where there's a potential impact.
But how do you know that?
On that centre?
Yeah. I think it's fairly straightforward. I think if you've got a qualifying development, and you would look at the catchment of that development and where it's likely to seek its trade from and have an impact upon, then you'd be looking at Royal Tunbridge Wells over 1,000 square metres and these other centres over 280 square metres. I think it's sufficiently clear to be effective.
Okay.
And I think we would seek to have these conversations as part of sort of pre-application discussions on any proposals coming forward and agree the approach.
Okay. My last point, so if I can come to, is a small point really, but it's the way the policy is set out and whether that's right and helpful, in that we have subheadings of sequential test and local impact test. But it seems to me, at least, that under the heading sequential test, point 1b starts to talk about impact. I wasn't sure whether that was helpful, and equally under local impact test, we talk about things like format and scale and flexibility, which is more of a sequential point. So I just wondered whether those sub points, or perhaps the subheadings are, which is not helpful. Just a thought.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Obviously, part one is about sequential, but it does start to talk about impact, doesn't it? Again, I'll leave that to the council. Is it unsound? You know, ultimately, if you fail the sequential test, and you know, planning permission would be refused. So I'll leave that with the council. It falls into that grey area, doesn't it? Of could it be worded better? Yes, possibly. Is it unsound? You know, the policy is considered as a whole. I'm not sure, but I'll leave it with the council. If they wanted to tidy it up and make it clearer, then I'd certainly support that.
Thank you.
Anything else then on sequential and impact tests? Or not? Yeah, I think the key thing really with the sequential especially is, you know, it is set out in national planning policy, and likewise with the local impact test. It's what your local plan has done is it sets a local threshold. Everything around that, so everything around the impact assessment and everything around the sequential assessment is just ensuring that the policy wording is consistent with national planning policies. There's no sort of nuances, there's no sort of inconsistencies there which could sort of crop up at development management stage. Okay, so we looked at the town centres. We'll go through this next issue. I think it's just one question or two questions maybe, and then we'll have a break and then come back to actually look at some of these sites. So within the town centre, you have specified primary shopping areas. Is that correct? That's certainly the case for Royal Tunbridge Wells. Do the other centres have primary shopping areas?
Yes, yeah, there's primary shopping areas defined within Royal Tunbridge Wells, Southborough, Paddock Wood, Cranbrook and Hawkhurst. And policy ED11 provides the policy for those.
And in terms of the boundaries themselves then, so for the primary shopping areas, did the Nexus study recommend any changes to primary shopping areas and retail frontages through its assessment? So any changes that this local plan seeks to make compared with the previous one?
Yes, so the Nexus work looked at, well, it looked at the town centre, sort of the defined town centre area, and also the primary shopping areas, and the council's also looked at the sort of primary shopping areas, and there are some tweaks that have been made to some parts of the primary shopping area, just small tweaks that have been made within this local plan, but they're clearly shown on the policies maps.
And in terms of Paddock Wood, let me just get the relevant map up, because we talked, didn't we, on the Paddock Wood day about just making the town centre sort of policy abundantly clear. So let me just bear with me, I'll just bring up the relevant map. Because there's an inset map for the town centre, I believe, isn't there?
There is, it's inset map 5.
Yeah, it's inset map 5 then. Sorry, I need the key as well. It's inset map 5, it's got the sort of the buff colour, which is the wider strategic site allocation. And then it's got a sort of burgundy colour. So is that the town centre boundary for the purpose of sort of these retail policies? Or is that something else?
Sorry, I was talking with my microphone off then. The town centre boundary is green on my screen. So it's just to the south of the railway line. We're not proposing to extend the town centre to the north of the railway line. Outlined in green, sorry, outlined in green. and then it's the sort of pinky colour that shades the town centre, and then the primary shopping area is coloured in purple, and the primary shopping frontages in a line of purple.
Click the wrong button. Right, okay, so yeah, so that's sort of darker purple colours, that's the primary shopping area, and then within that you've got the darker lines, which is the primary, other to the primary retail frontage then. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, just going back to the point, I think it was Claire Riley made earlier then, just in terms of what the master plan proposes for the town centre at Paddock Wood then. How do these two policies work then? So if I've got a sort of say retail development within Paddock Wood, I would go to these policies where we've looked at the town centre boundary and sort of the ED policies. How does that tie in with the strategic master plan then? So what's sort of proposed for the sort of town centre as a whole?
So obviously the policy STR SS2 was the policy that relates to Paddock Wood Town Centre, and that was initially seeking a framework master plan SPD for Paddock Wood Town Centre, and we had a lot of discussion about this towards the end of the Paddock Wood Day, and I recall, and I think this was the direction that we went to, that perhaps potentially moving away from the SPD and just having the policy set out the key parameters for the town centre. But our original proposal had been that we were looking to master plan Paddock Wood Town Centre, and we appended to our hearing statement the draft town centre master plan that had been prepared by David Lock Associates. Now, David Lock Associates did look at land to the north as well as the town centre, and this is potentially where there's some confusion. Now, that wasn't to look to allocate that land to the north, and we discussed this on the employment session, that land is not at this stage available, and we have no confidence that will become available over the plan period, hence why it's not been included in any of the wider master planning work. However, if we removed it from the key employment area, that land immediate to the north, as you can see on the inset map 5, it's not included within the brown triangle areas, so that if mixed use residential led schemes came forward, we would like to facilitate that to create a more sort of active focal point as you come off the railway line to the north of the town centre. But we considered but decided not to extend the town centre beyond the railway line, because we thought that a smaller self-contained town centre provided the greatest opportunity for investment to enhance its vitality and viability, and to create a focal point for expenditure. The draft master plan has looked at potential opportunities within Paddock Wood Town Centre, and predominantly it's land to the west of the primary shopping area. So we have land immediately to the south of the railway station, and we're in discussions with Network Rail there, because they own a lot of that land, about creating, removing the surface level parking and creating multi-storey car parks, so we can create sort of a more attractive focal point with some smaller units, work hub as well, which is a requirement of the policy. And then land to the south, you can sort of see a kind of triangle, a rectangle of land with a sort of western spike off of a rectangle, so it's a fairly awkward shape. And two of that parcel has been carved up through separate applications coming forward. One was granted at appeal for the Churchill retirement scheme, and the second, Station Road, which we referred to in our Paddock Wood hearing statement, has been recently granted planning permission alongside. But there remains a third parcel, and what we've done is sought to ensure that they can be connected together. So they're the key developments, and then we're seeking to keep Commercial Road as the key commercial focus. It aligned with the primary retail frontages, but to encourage the residential uses to create vibrancy and residential expenditure within the town centre, and other sort of key aspirations. And that's set out within our hearing statement to matter 6, issue 4. It's appended to that, the sort of key proposals. Now this is in draft form, so it doesn't yet carry weight, and the policy direction of that SS2 policy, well, I say the direction, but the way it might be implemented could change. But that was where we were we were looking to aspire on that.
So I'm so sorry.
Go.
I was going to say, just to clarify, STR-SS2 provides for the primacy of the Paddock Wood Town Centre in terms of retail hierarchy. We've already agreed, actually, that I think the policy ought to be amended so as to show support for the range of uses which are identified in the policy. And it's not dependent upon the framework master plan. If we're allowed to go through to modification stage, then we will, of course, also make changes to the major allocations in order to alter the emphasis which is placed on the framework master plan. We've been through that. I'm not going to repeat that today. However, what's clear is that the approach taken to the provision of local centres or neighbourhood centres within Paddock Wood, the Paddock Wood area, the major allocation will respect the primacy of Paddock Wood Town Centre, which is entirely protected by the ED policies, as we've discussed. So that's how we see it working.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, just in terms of the inset map, then that does clearly show that yeah, that's the town. So it's a town centre boundary and a primary shopping area, and also primary retail frontage then for Paddock Wood. Yeah. Okay, Claire Riley, please.
Hi, I don't want to be argumentative, but Mr. Young said that there's no plan to move the town centre to the north of the railway line. That land is not available. Bath House have submitted, they own that site, that large site to the north of the railway station, north of the railway line. They have submitted that as a plan, as a development site. And also there's a planning application currently under consideration. It's actually in, and we've been consulted on it. We are being consulted on it. To develop some land at Swatlands, which is well to the north of the railway line, and Bath House are actually planning to move onto that site. They'll be the key anchor tenant on that site, and that's been made clear to us at presentations. And the presentation the town council attended from David Locke Associates about the development of the town centre clearly showed the majority of the retail being moved onto that land to the north of the railway line. The Churchill development and the development by Icebox, which are both, I mean, Churchill are being built now and Icebox have got their planning commission and are starting soon. That effectively uses up all the spare land in the current town centre behind the Barsley's, which is I don't know what you call it, a mixed use store, and the other units in the high street. So there's no actual land really available to develop anything else to the south of the railway line. And it's fine. I don't think the town council have a particular problem. If the Bath House site is going to be developed and a lot of the retail is going to move to the north, provided the existing retail is protected to a certain extent, and there's connectivity between this to the south of the railway line to the north of the railway line, but we can't see any evidence of actually there being connectivity between the south and the north. And the railway line does act as a barrier. There's nothing there at the moment, and there's nothing in the local plan that identifies any sort of way of by cycling or walking safely crossing from the south to the north. The Maidstone Road where it crosses the railway bridge is that it's literally pavement on one side, and it's very, very narrow, it's very, very overgrown, and you take your life in your hands if you walk along it, especially if you've got a child in a buggy. So I think that it's being slightly misrepresentative, because if David Locke Associates have done all that work on the town centre, and they are showing the main town centre retail being moved to the north of the railway line, as you were suggesting earlier, you'd have retail at the bottom and high-rise or flats or development at the top. There's not necessarily a problem with that, but I think there needs to be some serious consideration at this stage, not kicked down the road, as to how you're going to connect the existing town to the north of the railway line. And the to the south of the railway line anymore. There might be a little sort of tiny area, but I can't see where it is because Icebox and Churchill have got planning permission, and obviously Churchill took out most of the land and they're already building it. I mean, they'll be finished probably finished by the autumn. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. So this goes back then to this small parcel of land which we've touched upon before, and I've asked questions about whether it's actually allocated and what's it allocated for, and we talked about the red line around the sort of northern parcel and some changes to the policy to make it clear which bits are actually allocated. So this this parcel of land, and it is shown on the indicative master plan, I think in a sort of buff colour. I think it's got a green line through it. So what and the rest of the land around it is just white land, sort of existing land. So what actually is this parcel allocated for, if at all?
Thank you.
You're asking me, Hannah.
Sorry, it's probably best for the council to answer this one.
Okay.
Thank you. So yes, we did discuss the bathhouse unit, I think at the employment session, and that is shown on map 28 in our local plan, in a buff colour, and is included within the strategic sites. It's been included in the wider strategic sites allocation, and that policy will apply. It is considered that would come forward for residential, potentially a mix of uses, which would have to be assessed against the policies in the plan, but that would come forward as residential. And if you look at page 54 of our the draft town centre master plan, which is appended to our Paddock Wood Town Centre hearing statement, you'll note that what is being shown as which could be provided to the north of the railway line, including the bathhouse unit, is predominantly residential uses. It's not retail or commercial development there. So we are aware Bathhouse, they put forward their sites in the course of sites. That's why we know it's available. We are aware that they are looking at alternatives. I don't think it's been agreed where that's going to be. So we are confident that can come forward for development, but at this stage, until they find an alternative premise, we haven't engaged in pre-application discussions, but we anticipate a predominantly residential led scheme there to provide between 40 to 140, depending on the scale, units. Just to quickly clarify on the connectivity point, and I think we did discuss this, the employment, but just for the avoidance of doubt, that there is infrastructure identified within the infrastructure framework for the strategic sites, including improvements to the Northeastern Railway Bridge from the eastern side of the town centre across the railway bridge to connect into the employment lands, and also, you know, LC WIP measures that have been fully costed and funded to enhance movements there, along with the bus routes and links.
Okay, diverged slightly, but nonetheless useful to do so. We'll go back to just want to sort of have a quick look at policy ED11, and then we'll have a break and then sort of come back and look at some of these sites in detail. So I'll just go back to the policy. Bear with me. Okay, so policy ED11 then, so this is where your primary shopping areas and retail frontage policy. The question that I had here was about, and question 2 really, how would a decision maker react to a proposal for a change of use away from a sort of main town centre use? And this is a question about what you've got in policy ED11 is some sort of detailed requirements about changes of use of ground floor premises within primary shopping areas. What then would the council seek to do if there was a change of use away from, away from a main town centre use? So outside of the primary shopping area, but still within the town centre boundary, what would that be permitted? Would that be refused? Where would the where does decision maker look for that?
Yeah, so I think it's coming back to the discussion we had earlier. I'd expect someone to go back to policy ED9. So in terms of the development proposals within the defined centres, I think the primary shopping areas are very much what the council are considering to be the sort of core retail, sort of main town centre uses, location. We specifically included retail frontages so that there's that protection at the ground floor for those active type uses. But as we discussed, changes of use of ground floor premises, to non-commercial, we wouldn't want to be seeing those within the primary shopping area. But outside of the primary shopping area, then we'd need to consider those on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think this is where there's a lack of clarity. I think as submitted, you will potentially get these sort of these sites that are within your town centres but are not within your primary shopping areas, where there is potential issues around uses that may sort of be only open certain times of the day, or even just non-commercial uses full stop. Where would you go to actually consider those? You might even be a residential use at ground floor. So I think there probably does need to be a bit of consideration then around it's clear what's required within primary shopping areas and retail frontages, but it's beyond those frontages that I'm not convinced. I'm not sure whether, because you talk about ED9, but I think that's more about promoting development, isn't it? Unless there's something within there. So it's just that consideration. It's that change of use. Your primary shopping areas are, what they say on the tin. Clearly, that's your primary focus. That's your main focus. But there may be some more flexibility outside and beyond of those areas.
We could consider looking at the 300-metre test, which is in the MPPF in relation to edge of town centre, edge of or outside of primary shopping areas. So leave that one with us and see if we can bring a bit more certainty in relation to that grey area between the primary shopping area and still being within the town centre retail function, but not being primary.
Yeah, and it may be that just the key consideration there is sort of beyond your primary shopping area is changes of use. Just need to consider their impact on the overall vitality and viability of the centre, having regard to the type of use, its proximity to other similar non-main town centre uses, etc.
Yeah, I think the evidence base for the plan will provide us with the basis to consider that.
Yeah. Okay, and I propose we'll take a break then. Oh, Mr. Herbert, anything pressing before we do so? Mr. Herbert, I've seen your hand go up. Anything pressing before we take a break?
Yes, thank you, sir. Ms. Riley has spoken about the wider town centre issues for Paddock Wood. I just wanted to raise one or 2 points. Your question was about how would a decision maker react in different circumstances. And I think, just first of all, going back to the primary retail frontage as shown in Paddock Wood, that there is a gap in the frontage on Commercial Road, and this is where there's an existing car park. I think the question is, as we've heard, there's potential for car parking to be rationalised in the town centre, potentially a new multi-storey. If a proposal came forward on the existing car park in Commercial Road, but it's not currently part of the primary retail frontage, how would that be determined? Because clearly it sits within that, and it's a gap at the moment, but it should contribute to the function and quality of that frontage. And I think the second is just for clarification of what the council means by over concentration of particular uses, which I think is in 2D, and it's that term is referred to in policy ED9 as well. And we're not clear how over concentration is defined, and how a decision maker would react to that. Would it be sensible to have a look at some other plans, for example, which establish clustering policies or percentage thresholds for particular uses that you might not wish to see an over-concentration of?
Okay, one for the council to answer. I think in terms of the first question, policy ED11 covers primary shopping areas and retail frontages. So policy ED11 would apply. Clearly, if there was a change, a development came along and there was a sort of changing something on the ground, then yeah, at the next plan review, the council would have to sort of consider that and consider whether or not it would still sort of make sense and the plans would still reflect what was there. Just in terms of the over concentration point, then obviously, yes, this isn't a plan which has the sort of typical, we've seen them, haven't we? So, you know, no more than 3 or, you know, percentage of units within a sort of run, etc. So does the council think this is justified then?
Yeah, I think we did previously, within the previous local plan, the local plan 2006 for the borough, there was a detailed threshold policy to resist the sort of over concentration, and it was quite a quite a detailed policy in that regard, with different thresholds for different sort of character areas within the town centre for Tunbridge Wells, and then we had thresholds for the other smaller town centres. We've moved away from that approach. I think sort of generally it's accepted that sort of very specific sort of percentage threshold isn't appropriate at the moment. That was very much within the evidence base, and I think reflects national policy in terms of the flexibility of uses. So we wouldn't want to be going as far as to putting a threshold in. I guess in terms of criteria D, the sort of over concentration is a matter of sort of fact and degree, and maybe it is something that we could add some text within the supporting text to the policy of what an over concentration might be considered. I can have a look back in the evidence base, to see if that helps us with that. But I think it's just trying to sort of resist this sort of sort of long stretches of certain uses within some of the sort of primary shopping areas, but not going as far as having a percentage threshold, which we think is too restrictive.
Yeah, I agree. If you want to look at it, you can do. The danger is, isn't it? The danger is in trying to determine this, you end up referring to numbers and percentages and the rest of it. But yeah, I agree. You'll see that the emphasis of the plan isn't to have that approach. So I think it's have a look at it, but I think don't get drawn too much into it, because there's a danger then that you end up back down the role of supporting text referring to numbers and percentages and all the rest of it, which then it sort of starts to undermine the policy. Okay, we'll take a break. Let's say time's pressing on, but I think we still should get through the various sites. If not, there's plenty of reserved sessions within the programme, so we can always come back to these issues. So we'll take just over 10 minutes, if that's okay, and we'll come back at 20 past. So again, don't log out, just sort of mute cameras and microphones, and we'll have an adjournment and return at 20 past. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll resume and continue, and we'll continue to start looking at some of these commercial mixed-use sort of town centre allocations. And again, with lunch break we scheduled at 1. We can go a little bit beyond 1 o'clock, but we'll see how we get through. As I said before, if we don't get through all the sites, then we can always come back to them. RTW2 we'll start with, which is land at the auction house, Linden Park Road. I have some questions there about sort of previous approvals, and the council in their hearing statement have given some details of the planning history of the site. So what, going forward then, what are the sort of landowners or site promoters intending for the site? And does that then align with the proposed allocations? Obviously, the allocation within the plan is sort of pretty flexible, really. It talks about a mix of uses, range of uses, residential, shops, commercial, restaurant, etc., etc. So do those sort of aspirations line up with then the allocation?
Yes, as you've referred to, our statement sets out the sort of the background to the site and the previous consents that have been permitted. We provide in our statement paragraphs 5 to 10 an update on things in terms of the permitted scheme and how that has been implemented, but that the site promoters are still keen to further the uses on the site. We've had some early pre-application discussions in relation to that, and the policy is drafted, as you said, policy ALRTW2 is fairly flexible in the mix of uses that would be considered appropriate on the site. So the policy allows for the what we understand to be the sort of preferred use coming forward on that site, mix of town centre uses and possibly some residential as well. So the policy does allow for that.
Yeah. Okay. Any comments or representations on RTW2 then from anybody? Yeah. Dr. Whitbourne, please. Can you hear me, Dr. Whitbourne? Chris, I'm not sure if Dr. Whitbourne's having a problem turning his...
just checking now. His
that
mic's on now.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right. Only to say that the building in question was designed as an auction house and it functioned as that for a while. It ceased to do so and was empty probably at the time this plan was written. It's now a very successful, I think, cafe. I frequent it, and it's functioning nicely as a cafe and food shop. Okay, I mute it again.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and as I said before, it talks about the mixed uses within the policy for any potential redevelopment. The garden centre ALRTW 14 then. Couple of questions here. Obviously, again, I've seen the council's statement on this one. This is a site that is within the greenbelt. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Yeah.
Sorry, David Scully, Landscape and Biodiversity Officer for the council.
So in terms of the actual area that was proposed for residential development, obviously the policy talks about the sort of the two uses rather than the sort of entire redevelopment sort of per se. What does the council envisage would be the area for residential development? So where is it going to be, and what do you envisage the use of the wider site being going forward?
So the gross area for the whole site is about 7.5 hectares, as done through the Sheila. The developable area that is on the plan is about 4 hectares. The existing garden centre wants to remain on site, the operator, and wants to expand slightly. We understand that to require, in total, existing and proposed, around about 2 hectares, which leaves around about 2 hectares of land available for within what's shown as the developable area for housing. However, it is still sort of constrained. There's a watercourse to the south and rising land to the north. So the plan in our statement, which shows on page 14, it shows an aerial photograph from around about 2000, shows the existing garden centre in the southeast corner. And the car parking for that is immediately to the north currently, and to the sort of northeast. To the immediate west, there's areas, this is obviously developed a little bit since then, areas of for setting out plants outside and so on. And the garden centre is expected to remain in that location, although it may be reconfigured, but in that broad location, so in the sort of south and southeast of the site. And the housing would stretch along an area going westward. But we've left it flexible because obviously that would depend on the details that come forward.
What's the sort of current, obviously you provided that previous area photograph, so what's the current sort of condition and use of that wider parcel of land then?
So in the plan that you see, if you was to look at this today on an aerial photograph, it looks almost like a wooded site. But the area around the existing or the historical where the buildings have been is mostly, say, car park, hard standing and so on. The area which is as shown on this historical photograph as what are the sort of standing out beds for growing container plants is sort of overgrown with sort of like goat willow. All the sort of bits of pathways and materials used for those beds, often bits of gravel or weed suppressant matting, that sort of thing, are still evident underneath the undergrowth that's there. And it is, though that area is, as you would expect, because it's for setting out containerized plants, relatively flat. North of that, you can see on the historical photographs lines of plants, and those would have been plants, mainly sort of trees and large shrubs, which have been open ground grown and sold to customers at the garden centre. That kind of trade no longer goes on in particularly in garden centres these days and in local centres. A lot of that material has been left in situ and has matured, and so has the appearance of a woodland. But when you look closely, you can see it's ornamental plants in a row. There's a number of sort of self-seeded plants within that. So it is developing, but could do with some intervention and management. To the south, it's still quite natural. There's a stream corridor with natural vegetation and so on going through there. There is some invasive weeds and so on, which needs to be controlled, but it's much more natural against the railway and against the streamline.
So again, just in terms of the justification for site, and what at a site-specific level then, what are the sort of exceptional circumstances which justify taking this site out of the green belt then? And as particularly given given what you've described, really, obviously that it did have this sort of commercial use, but it's sort of now, like you say, sort of becoming sort of more natural and sort of overgrown, and you've got these trees, etc. So what's the justification now for taking it out of the green belt and redeveloping it for housing?
So refer you to our response to question 7, sir. Firstly, there is an error in the text on paragraph 45. The final sentence on page 16 of that, instead of saying relatively weak, it should say moderate. And instead of figure 6.1, it should say table 6.1 on page 28. That was the stage 2 study. In terms of the exceptional circumstances, we've obviously set out the, as you've heard before, the overall rationale and the exceptional circumstances that exist. That with this particular site, we have a large area which is maybe regarded as previously developed, certainly as contaminated. All the materials and so on are still there and still evident on site. And even the land to the north is, say, affected by the ornamental planting and so on. So bringing forward development in this area can bring about some positive landscape changes to the site, which is, say, very site specific. It's also an existing use on site and provides for that to be expanded slightly. So we see that as being positive elements. My colleague, Ms. Banks, may have some further details to add on that, but I think that sets out the main purposes of the release.
Yeah, and just in terms of the two uses, then also I've asked a question about, sort of, I think it was question 5 about safe and suitable access. So how would the two uses work alongside each other then, in terms of just access and just sort of day-to-day sort of comings and goings? And obviously you've got the main entrance into the garden centre, haven't you? And the car parks. How would all this sort of fit together and work?
My colleague may give some further details on the highway scenes, but just as a bit of background, the existing building, the site for some time was, I suppose, considered to be perhaps declining or not doing so well. The new owners have put a new lease of life into the site. It's much more vibrant. There's much more activity and so on. So that's very positive. But the main core of the buildings that represent the site are quite old. And so it's likely within further investment, some major reconfiguration of the sites would take place. That would enable the sort of safe separation within the site between the garden centre activity and the residential activity. And that doesn't seem an insurmountable issue. There's a number of sites where commercial activity and residential may take place in quite close juxtaposition. But I'll let Miss Evans provide some further details on that.
Yeah, just sort of drawing on what Mr. Scully said, I think the site is allocated for expansion of the existing garden centre use, and that's reflective of the sort of information we've received from the agent, on behalf of the site owners, that the site, that is for first and foremost a sort of garden centre operators. So they want to maintain their business on the site, but they would like to see other uses on the site as well. You will have seen from the previous version of the Reg 18 local plan that we had allocated it as a retail sort of convenience food offer. We discussed that to some extent in the session just now, that it's now considered in relation to the updated retail work in 2021, that there's no longer the need to identify a site for convenience retail, and certainly the site being considered sort of edge of centre wouldn't be appropriate. It could have an impact on the town centre. So we sort of moved away from that element of the allocation, and sought to just allocate the site as a expansion of the garden centre, recognising that's an existing commercial use there and supporting that, but also an element of residential that would be appropriate and supported by the owner as well. So the policy very much reflects that.
Yes, the policy obviously refers to allocating for the expansion of the existing use class garden centre, and it specifically refers to that. In terms of the scale, obviously there's a scale of approximately 25 to 30 residential dwellings. Obviously, you've talked about that, and we've talked in previous sessions about how these were calculated. In terms of the expansion of the existing garden centre, then there's no requirement on scale, I don't think. What sort of size of expansion would you envisage, and why does the policy not say set a floor space limit or set a specific site area for the expansion of the garden centre?
The existing use of the garden centre is around about 1.5 hectares, and I say the landowners indicated they would want to increase that to around about 2 hectares. So that's an increase in about half a hectare.
And again, just in terms of sort of seeking to sort of control development and being clear to use the plan, what's going on this site. Again, what was the reason for not either setting it out on the sort of indicative inset map or giving a sort of site area or floor space threshold for this sort of use?
I think the flexibility and the details needed, the detail will be needed to actually set it out on the actual allocation map plan, which element was for residential and which element was for garden centre. I think possibly we could consider whether it's appropriate to limit the garden centre to a percentage or a set amount of the area. Would have to have a think about that, but I think that's quite possible to control that if that is a concern.
I think it's more it is more a query than necessarily a concern as such. In terms of the greenbelt boundary, then you've got the area to the sort of north of the allocation would be open space and landscaping. Is that correct? So is that within the site boundary? So sort of the different shade of green, presumably that's just a landscape buffer within the site boundary, is it?
I didn't realise on mute. I was just trying to locate the map for that, which I appear to have lost. Had on my screen and now it's disappeared. Oh, here we go. Yes. So. The land to the north would actually remain as greenbelt of the actual allocation, and is shown at the moment to be actually outside the allocation. Let's have a look. So yes, the proposal map shows it all within the allocation. It can be controlled within any consent given to provide for improvements. In terms of the greenbelt boundary, it would follow the proposed area of development to the north, but it's being extended to the south. Otherwise, there'd be a small slither of greenbelt running down the length of the railway line, and you can see that on the plan. This is probably a similar issue that you referred to, sir, earlier about being clear about any small additional adjustments to the greenbelt over and above the actual allocation. And so this would be picked up in that schedule that you've already asked for.
So in terms of the greenbelt boundary, then, in terms of sort of long-term, clearly identified defensible boundaries, etc., you've got there's a row of properties to the north.
Yes.
So they're within the greenbelt.
Yes.
And then you'd have this sort of this landscaped area of this site, which I presume is on, that's to do with the topography then, is it? So that's on the sort of rising ground as the land goes up.
Yeah, there's a very sharp division or change in levels because the ground has been altered in the past. It's very flat, and then there's automatically a very steep embankment going to the north, and that provides a sufficient boundary to work to in terms of greenbelt and development.
Yes, that was my next question, Ray. Do you think that is an appropriate greenbelt boundary then, rather than using that sort of road to the north?
I think it's our preference because then that's protecting that land and the that which is on rising ground and much more visible in the way that greenbelt's intended to do.
Okay. Any questions, objections, representations then on RTW 14 from anybody who's made reps on this site? No. Okay, we'll move on. The next site, RTW1, which is the former cinema site. Obviously, before we sort of get into the detail of this, obviously I'm well aware of obviously the background to this site and the history of it, and everything that's gone before. So I've read a lot of representations about this particular site, and obviously seen it when we were down last time we met in the town hall. So I know obviously the history behind it, and I know what's gone before. In terms of the allocation in the plan then, within the various representations and within the council statements, and we've touched upon this before, haven't we, in terms of meeting needs and needs for older people, etc. In terms of what the council envisaged coming forward for the site, again, just by way of introduction, does that then sort of tally up with what the local plan is seeking to allocate the site for? So have things progressed whilst this local plan has been prepared and sort of submitted and examined, which have maybe sort of overtaken where the local plan was in terms of its rationale and thinking for this site?
So certainly things have progressed since this policy was drafted. And I think it's appropriate that you're updated with respect to the current status of the prospective application which is being made. You will learn from that that the proposal is for way in excess of 100 residential units. And in the form of the proposal that's coming forward, which we anticipate will be for extra care accommodation, it's proposing 160 plus units, as I understand it. So in that respect alone, the policy would need to reflect the greater density that might be achieved in relation to that kind of provision, firstly. Secondly, the policy ought expressly to incorporate the possibility that some or all of those residential dwellings might be extra care accommodation. And it ought also to retain the flexibility in relation to the provision of other uses, but be more flexible in the sense that it refers to may include a cinema, cafes, drinking establishments, because we know actually from the evidence base that the prospects of the cinema use coming onto the site are quite low. So yes, I think as an introduction, quite clearly matters need to be reflected upon as they currently are. And we ought to think about this policy being modified to increase the prospective density and to refer to extra care provision, as I've suggested. So on that basis, can we just update you as to the status of the current prospective application? Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. My name's Antonia James. I'm one of the principal planning officers at Tunbridge Wells Borough Council and the case officer for the cinema site application. So to date, we have had 4 pre-application discussions with the agents and developer for the cinema site. During the pre-application discussions, we've had Historic England present at those meetings. We had the last meeting last week, which was discussing the very finer detail, sort of going down to, you know, windows, balcony designs, etc. They are going to submit an application. Their deadline is the end of July this year. Sorry, can you hear me okay? Because my internet connection is unstable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. As I said, we've got down to all the finer details, including landscaping, location of trees, etc., etc. So we're expecting an application to be submitted by the end of this month. I know from the hearing statement that you've got, it sets out roughly what that application will include, which is 165 extra care units, and it will also include some communal facilities for the residents of those extra care units, plus some of those will be open to members of the public as well, including sort of health and well-being facilities. It has a courtyard arrangement with a restaurant within the courtyard, which will be open up to members of the public, with other sort of retail commercial uses at the ground floor level, facing onto Mount Pleasant Road. Approximately 60 car parking spaces at basement level. And in terms of sort of the design has been designed to respect the Victorian railway line underneath the site, so it will be single story above that Victorian railway line with the sort of the rest of the massing set back. It would be no higher than the consented scheme, and we have had no objections to the development from Historic England, and I have that in writing. Thank you, sir.
So in terms of its sort of deliverability or developability within the plan period, seen representations suggesting that this site's not going to come forward for proposed uses. Obviously, you know, long sort of complex site history to it. So just in terms of the current proposals, then, how do they sit with sort of land ownerships? How is this site going to come forward? How's it going to be delivered in terms of the sort of makeup of the allocation, in terms of who owns the land, especially?
So retirement villages have an option on this site, and they are intending to bring it forward as one development. It will come forward in one phase. We have, as may have been set out in the statement of common ground, we have a planning performance agreement in place to determine the application within the statutory target date. We're expecting a decision in the autumn. They're intending retirement villages to commence development on the site in 2024, with all units completed by the end of 2025.
You mentioned the railway line in particular, and sort of below ground works and different scales of building, etc. So how sort of comfortable and confident are the council then that this is a scheme which can be sort of not only viable but also feasible then in terms of actually delivering what's proposed? So what sort of work have you seen or evidence have you sort of commissioned to sort of give you confidence then about the actual deliverability of this site within the plan period?
So we've been in regular contact with retirement villages throughout this process, and they started very early engagement with Network Rail regarding the issue of the train line. Retirement villages have entered into an agreement with Network Rail, an asset protection agreement, to sort of deal with all the sort of the finer details of that, but we do not consider that to be a constraint to the development. As I said, they have designed it so that it would be single story above above the railway line itself, and therefore moving the sort of the weight issue to other parts of the site. But we are confident, obviously there was a former cinema, quite a large building on the site, which was constructed in the 1930s. Obviously sort of technical engineering, etc. has moved on since then, and they managed to successfully build that building in the 1930s above that Victorian railway line. There was also similar concerns about the demolition of the former cinema building and the associated shops, etc. And that was demolished without any issues.
So I would just add, sorry, it's David Scully, that it's not uncommon for works to proceed close to, over, adjacent to, even under railway lines, and agreements have to be entered into. It is a particular complexity of this site, but at the very first meeting, in terms of with the applicants, that the issue was raised and they were fully aware of it, and were already considering how they would overcome that issue. So we've got every confidence that whilst adding complexity and cost to the scheme, it's not ultimately a barrier to development.
Okay, as soon as I mentioned deliverability and certainly ownership, Mr. Lippard and Dr. Whitbourne's hands went up, so we'll go there next then. So we'll go to Brian Lippard. I don't think we've heard from you yet, so we'll go to Mr. Lippard if we will.
Thank you, sir. Brian Lippard on behalf of the Tunbridge Wells Civic Society. The councillor just alluded to a potential update on the use of the site. We had meeting with the developers last week, and I have to say it came as something of a surprise to us when they announced that it was no longer going to be aimed at people 55 plus, but they're now targeting 80 plus, and it's to be the whole site to be a care home, as we've understood it. Now, the illusions that the members of the council made there rather downplayed it. And so my particular question to the council is, do you actually want a care home slap bang on a prime site in the middle of the town? Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Whitbourne, please.
There?
Yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me? No.
Yep, we can.
Yes, you can. Sorry, I'm advised not to tempt the machine with the video side. Yes, I was at the meeting with Retirement Villages group, who put on a very slick and professional presentation that seems to have gone down well with council officers. I hope it won't go down as well with council members. There is a planning permission that's given on the site previously to Elysian, which they came forward with in 2017. There were protests about that, but it nevertheless got through, unfortunately. But Elysian can't make it work. It is a difficult site, not only because of the railway, there are rights of way across it, and the levels, both down Mount Pleasant and also transversely across the site, are difficult, to say the least. It is a difficult site to develop. The Retirement Villages 165 C2 retirement homes have produced an eight-story block on the corner of Church Road and Mount Pleasant, which to my mind is absolutely horrendous and completely wrong in relation to the listed town hall on the opposite corner and the listed Lloyd's Bank on the corner of Crescent Road. And I very much hope that the new council administration, which has changed since the May election, may take a different view from their predecessors and refuse the thing, because I think it would be really a monstrous development in Tunbridge Wells. Given that there is no viable approved scheme on the site, it seems to me that it would be a great pity if an unsuitable old people's home of this massive nature was approved for the site before the town centre area plan is produced. In my belief, although I can understand everybody that thinks this cinema, as it closed 22 years ago, and we're all fed up with having hoardings around what looks like a bomb site, to produce something that's as wrong as this present proposal would be even worse than waiting till something really much more appropriate comes forward, hopefully within the context of the emerging town centre area plan. So I hope that you won't amend the plan to comply with the wishes of Retirement Villages Group. Thank you, sir.
In terms of the in terms of obviously Miss Whitbourne and Miss Lippard, your concerns that you've raised, are these concerns with the sort of specific scheme that, you know, it isn't before me, and it's not my role to determine that? That's for the council. Is your concern with the specific nature of that scheme, or the actual use per se? Obviously, you both referred to the sort of C2 use that's being proposed. Obviously, it's a town centre site. The council is seeking a policy at the local plan which effectively gives flexibility to the type of use. Are your concerns therefore more aimed at the scale of development, its design, what it's going to look like, etc., rather than necessarily the use, or is it the use as well? So, question for Mr. Lippard first.
I can understand Philip's concerns and I would share them, but I realise this is a local plan inquiry, and I would very much, and it's actually worthwhile that this has come up, this idea of a care home in the centre of the town, because it seems to me that a local plan really should be giving a statement to say we actively encourage care homes in the centre of the town, and that's what we want, through to maybe the other extreme. We do not want a care home. We will not look favourably on it, and you can expect any planning application to be refused. Or in the middle, I suppose you could take the general thing, which is, well, we'll judge each case on its merits. So if a developer comes up with something or other, a sports hall or a swimming pool or a care home or retirement home, we'll just look at it on its merits. And I really think, sir, I would hope we would get some specific guidance from a local plan as to what is the council's policy, what does it think towards such a thing as a care home in the middle of the town.
So just in terms of what the local plan should say then, so is it your view then that the local plans are just, well, two things the local plan could do in this situation, I suppose. Do you think the local plan should be very, very specific and sort of setting out, this is what it's going to be built as, this is what, you know, the number of units will be, or do you think the local plan should just give us that headline flexibility and say, well, look, you know, this site's had a complex planning history, you know, schemes have come forward and haven't materialised, and actually, you know, we will as a council consider you know, a whole range of, you know, they call them essentially main town centre uses and residential uses, but essentially we'll just consider each scheme on its merits and just give that flexibility to say, well, if it's the right scheme and it's the right design, then we'll support it. And the actual uses, a mix of uses, will leave to that sort of plan application process rather than trying to sort of firm up uses now? Or do you think it should do the opposite? And do you think it should actually be very specific and say, no, this is what we want, this is what it should do?
I would really hope that the local plan would indicate things like whether we do or we don't want a community health, a walk-in healthcare centre in the centre of town, to give an indication of, do we want more hotels in the centre of the town or don't we? There was another plan, a developer was going to put in quite an amusement centre in Calverley precinct. Can't remember it on the BHS site. Is that something the council wants to encourage or doesn't it? I would hope that a local plan would give guidance to developers to give them an indication of what is likely to be looked for favourably and what isn't. And that's before you get anywhere near considering the actual quality of the brickwork, the layout, the height, etc. of the design.
So as far as local plan's concerned, then, do you think it should just set out, you know, this is a, you know, key development site, and we will, you know, subject to meeting other policies in the plan on design, heritage, etc., you know, we will actively encourage or actively support a list of uses, and then just list uses and say, well, in principle, these are the uses we support. However many dwellings it is, however many stories it is, that's for the individual planning application process to determine.
In a word, yes.
Yeah.
And that has been done in the site allocations plan in the past, and I think in the local plan, indications have been given as to the type of thing that will be considered. Whether by implication, if something is not on the list, then that is ruled out, is a matter for debate. And particularly here with this idea for a care home, I dare say nobody ever thought of it as being a possibility. So the idea of actually ruling it out in a local plan probably quite validly never occurred to anybody.
Sir, I wonder if I could intervene at this point. Mark Booker from the Town Forum.
Okay, yeah.
We also took part in the meetings that have been referred to by Brian Lippard and Dr. Whitbourne. In considering the draft submission local plan, we didn't make specific comment on the cinema site because it was designated for C3 residential plus a lot of ancillary business and retail uses, which we felt to be satisfactory. Now a plan has come forward for a C2 development, which is a very different animal, sir. My colleagues have referred to the risk of loss of vitality by having that use, but there are also other issues, such as affordable housing, where a C2 development doesn't have to provide or consider any substitute affordable housing, and we know that there is in the town a crying need for affordable housing, and indeed affordable housing for elderly people. So, in terms of the use, we do find this to be potentially a very unsatisfactory use for the site. With regard to the scheme itself, I think I'd agree with your assessment that the actual planning application is not relevant to the local plan in terms of the architecture, massing, and so forth, but would concentrate on the use which the council's own statement rather fudges over and doesn't indicate that it was actually scheduled for a C3 residential purposes, which we would support, and we would also support the much higher density which is proposed by the present developers. So I hope that may just help on that point of information, sir.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Ms. Borland next, please.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to say that CPRE can support the views of the town forum and and Mr. Lippard. I spoke earlier about the need for vitality and what residential development would give. I'm not convinced that a C3 development of this type actually contributes well to the vitality of the town centre. So just in support of the issues that have been raised by the other speakers. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Mr. Jones.
Good afternoon, sir. I don't think you can see me, but can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah, there you are. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Sir, obviously, as you know, we're in an appeal and we've got closing submissions, and I recognise some of the officers who were giving Miss Antonia James. It's very important. There are 2 points that the council's position shouldn't be driven just so partly by the position that we have on our appeal, where we have an appeal for extra care in respect of this site. So there are 2 things we'd like to say on 2 topics. I'll be very brief. And Miss Miles, the first point is on the use of the change of the policy and the lack of evidence base for this sudden shift. And really, we don't have to say very much. We just echo what Mr. Brooker eloquently put, and which on behalf of the Civic Forum, and what has been said equally eloquently by the Civic Society and others. This is a significant change and shift in the proposed use of the land. And it is clear from what you've heard, sir, that there are different views, important views, which simply haven't been canvassed as part of the planned process. And we've looked at the evidence base, and there's no evidence base that justifies this shift from a mixed use basis with residential to a care home, and that needs to be properly evidence-based and set out and debated. And we've heard all different issues that have arisen about that, and the loss of the cinema, which there was an evidence base for, as contributing to the vitality and the character, is just one example of many of the issues, the loss of affordable housing provision. So there's a main planning policy issue, which is very much in your territory, which simply hasn't been properly or soundly evidenced for this shift. We don't even have a draft before you as to what the council is proposing. None of us here, even today, at this last moment, know what's being proposed in terms of shift of policy. Second thing is on deliverability. And this is one where the site has proved to be undeliverable, and with an appellant that even got planning permission, and no doubt entered into negotiations with Network Rail. The asset protection agreement, I'm not aware of whether the council has seen it. I'm assuming they haven't seen it, because we have asked on a number of occasions at the other ongoing inquiry before your colleague, of witnesses of the council who've referred to its existence, as Miss James has done, and we've asked for it to be produced. So if there's going to be any reliance on such agreements to overcome what has been obviously a material logistical problem, then it needs to be transparent, and one needs to see what's actually happened. And there's been reference to other logistical points as well. But we do say that given the background and history, the absence of that disclosure is telling. Those are the two topics I wanted to touch on. Ms. Miles just has an additional point to make, sir.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to take you to a couple of references. One is para 5.32 of the submission local plan, which refers to the site having a prominent corner position and being well located for a range of town centre uses. And I think it's key there that the objective of the plan was looking at a range of town centre uses. And now we're told that the cinema is lost from the retirement village proposal. And if you look, so at the evidence base, CD 3.30, the Tunbridge Wells Retail and Leisure Study Report from April 2017, that commented at para 3.57 that the provision of a new cinema could be supported, as well as additional family dining, restaurant and fitness facilities. Para 8.11 and figure 8.1 of that is a survey of the study area, and it shows that the second most popular activity is going to the cinema. If you then turn to the update report, which is the 2021 update of the retail, commercial, leisure and town centre uses study, that's CD 3.86A. So I'm just bringing that up on my screen as well, sir. So that commented para 3.135 that operators such as Everyman, which is, as I understand it, what was envisaged for the cinema site on the consented scheme, that they can operate on a significantly smaller footprint. And the evidence base, this assessment goes on to refer at para 3.137 that the leisure concept having anchor tenants encourages consumers to combine activities, increasing footfall, which links to the points I think that the town forum are making about viability and vitality of town centres. And if you look then at para 3.149 of the update, that comments that the provision of a smaller boutique cinema in the town centre, such as that proposed on the former ABC cinema site, may help encourage footfall and also lead to further ancillary town centre uses. What we're hearing is that the council are dropping the cinema through the submission of an application by retirement villages. There's no evidence that I can see that points to how that can be acceptable. It's clearly an objective of this plan, as submitted, to have a cinema use within this site to help encourage footfall into the town. It's a key site in town, as you've heard. And then on the point of deliverability, I just wanted to draw your attention back to matter 9 and appendix 2, which was the delivery trajectory. We had the hearing session a couple of weeks ago. If you look at that appendix, the second line, former cinema site, it's got 0 in the deliverability. And what we're now being told is that this site will deliver in 2024, 2025. And that's not reflected in the council's trajectory. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. So go back to the council. So a couple of points really, key points really for me to consider to see the council's views on is obviously the suitability, without sort of getting drawn into the detail of any scheme or design, etc., but just the suitability of the use that you would seek to modify the plan, or seek me to recommend to modify the plan to include, which is this sort of C2 use. And then also how that sits then with the sort of wider sort of vision strategy of the plan, the points that Ms. Miles has just made there about, you know, its location, its position within the town centre, sort of vibrancy, footfall, those sort of points, please.
So just bear with us. I'm just having a conversation.
If I just start, sir, Antonia James again, Principal Planning Officer, and then I'll pass over to my colleagues in the planning policy team. But just to sort of explain, as you've probably seen from the background documents, there was a minor amendment application to a 2017 application that came in 2019, which sought some changes to the scheme, and that was the Elysian retirement scheme. And within that, although it was C3 units, it did restrict the age occupancy of the units to people over 65 years old. So all of those units that have got consent, and that consent, you know, is a live consent. It has been implemented, and we have got a certificate of lawful development for that site. You know, those units are over 65 years, for people over 65 years old, and it was at that time intended to be developed by Elysian, who are a provider of extra care accommodation. Elysian, as you're probably aware, are now developing the Arriva bus depot site for extra care accommodation on St John's Road in Tunbridge Wells. So in terms of the scheme coming forward, it's really going to be for a similar sort of age group of people, whether it will be over 65 or whether it will be over 60 years old. But just to stress, it's not going to be a care home. It's going to be housing with care. It will be extra care accommodation, and usually in such instances, people would need to meet a sort of a minimum care package of 2 hours per week of personal care, and these people are expected to be quite active elderly people, that will make a contribution to the local community. Retirement villages themselves are a long established provider of integrated retirement communities in the UK. They've got a very good track record of delivery. And in terms of what's been said previously, the target age of 80 plus, that's it may be that there will be people that are of that age group there, but it's much likely to have a younger age restricted within any sort of legal agreement. And this scheme is coming about in terms of making it viable. The previously consented scheme had quite large apartment units, so they're right sizing the apartments. In their view, it is omitting the cinema. And there is a reduction as well in retail commercial uses. So they can deliver a viable scheme on the site with the 165 extra care units that are proposed to come forward. Thank you.
And just a second comment then about the sort of the loss of the cinema, smaller retail use, etc., etc. So sort of greater emphasis on the sort of residential elements of it rather than the sort of mix of uses. Just again, what the council's views are on on that and what the plan should do?
So the present proposed application doesn't contain a cinema. The question is what the policy provides for. And the policy does provide for that possibility, and that's not going away. That's the first point. The second point in terms of viability is interesting as background information to that. And I'm just going to ask actually for reference to the viability assessment. Sharon, could you refer to the document? Yeah. I don't have the document in front of me, but
yeah, it was just coming back on one of the points raised about the cinema. Paragraph 8.17 of the Nexus study 2021. This is, Ms. Miles obviously referred to some of the other commentary from the retail study, but in the recommendations section at section 8, it does consider this issue and saying whilst town centre allocations for use cinema on theatre floor space remain desirable, but in brackets, if not necessary, viability and deliverability remains challenging. So I don't think we're not saying that we don't want to see a cinema on the site. It obviously would be an attractive use on the site, but it's that there are concerns in terms of viability and deliverability of that. It would be down to an application coming forward to demonstrate that.
So in relation to this issue about the evidence base, one's got to keep a sense of perspective on this. What's being proposed through the application, and when I spoke about a possible modification to the policy, one, to increase the number, but two, to include reference to extra care. And I know what my learned friend has said and keeps telling us that it's C2. It may not necessarily be so. It depends upon the level of care being provided. And that may vary, as it were, between resident and resident. The fact of the matter is, we're talking about the prospects of a higher density, which should be admitted. And one can foresee no off-site planning implications in relation to that, bearing in mind this is a prime town centre site. And secondly, it is essentially residential, whatever level of care is being offered. So we've got to keep a sense of perspective and proportion in relation to this. And so criticisms that the evidence base isn't there to support this actually doesn't take the issue very much further. But I notice the learned friends coming back.
Okay, no, points noted. I don't want to go too much into that. The question I have for the council really, and it's the same question that I asked Mr. Lippard. So I asked the same question to the council. Do you think the plan should essentially take an approach of, rather than try and say it will be this use and it will be this number of dwellings, whether or not the plan should actually say, well, like you say, recognise that this is a key town centre site, and you are wanting a sort of really high quality scheme here, but whether or not the plan should just recognise, well, these are the type of uses that would be acceptable, and essentially list those uses which you consider acceptable, and not try to get drawn too much into the specifics of even numbers and quantums, and just say, well, look, this is, you could even make the plan abundantly clear. It's a key town centre site. You want to see this site come forward. It's had this long history. Nothing's been happening. It hasn't come forward. Schemes have had planning permission and not come forward. And just recognise that these are the type of uses that will be permitted on the site. And you set out your development requirements about high quality design, heritage, etc. Recognising that it does have this sort of almost sort of key gateway function about its position, relationships to town hall, etc. And then just leave it for the development management and plan application process to determine numbers, scales, stories of buildings. If they're not acceptable, then there'd be plenty within the plan for the council to turn around and say, no, this isn't what we want. For example, it's not got the right mix of uses. It doesn't have that ground floor sort of active frontage. It's too big. It's not the right design. It's too many units, and just leave it for the planning process to determine.
That's an entirely reasonable approach, and it's not inimical to rational forward planning at all, principally because it recognises that it's free to be developed for town centre type uses, however they may come about. It just so happens that we have a scheme which realises greater potential in this site than the policy does, in terms of the number of units, at least, in terms of density, potentially. So there's nothing wrong with taking that kind of approach. It may impact on assumptions about the delivery of housing and the trajectory, but not in such a way it's going to have any material impact on the trajectory. So that is another alternative approach, which we can certainly take into account and consider. And it may be so that if you feel we are able to go through to modification stage, that is something which you may indicate we should take on board anyway, as a refinement to this policy, to allow greater flexibility in order to maximize its potential for redevelopment in the future.
And I can see Mr. Jones has got his hand up, but I don't want to get drawn into the whole C2, C3 argument. We've spent a lot of this examination talking about exactly those points. And the point that I think I'm making there is, by taking this flexible approach, is there are so many sort of nuances within that whole C2, C3 argument, even in itself. It's the type of scheme that, we've heard from representatives, saying, well, we don't want this sort of care home development, but it almost sounds as actually all of that will be determined by the actual nature of the scheme. So, like you say, it comes down to the type of units, the size of them, how they're laid out, how they're orientated, what else is on the site. All of that really is so site specific that I wonder whether there's a danger, as part of a local plan examination, that there's a danger then that the local plan becomes informed by a scheme that hasn't even entered the council's sort of plan application process. The council hasn't even made its mind up whether that's acceptable. And I think there is a danger then that we can almost sort of get too carried away with that is the scheme when it's not, because it's not, it hasn't been approved. It's at a pre-application stage. And actually, I think it may be more appropriate to take a step back and say, no, key town centre site, really emphasise that these are the types of uses we want to see. The suitability of it really comes down to its particular design, and that goes down to uses, scale, numbers even, really. And it sounds like the numbers as well would even be informed by some very detailed structural and viability evidence either. That might be the determinative factor as well, which is linked again to a very specific site and a very specific scheme. So that may be the way forward.
We'll give that some thought, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Jones?
So I'm not going to the C2, C3 debate, no, but we would echo what you said. We think, for reasons that you may anticipate, that the cart is driving the horse here, that this needs to be looked at, again, as a town centre site, and not be driven by something that hasn't even a scheme we're told about, but hasn't yet reached an application. So what we would say is, obviously, if it is being contemplated in another sense, then the plan in having to discharge the various requirements in terms of different types of housing, for reasons that we won't repeat, will need to condescend to give some more prescriptive guidance. If, and we say the council hasn't even got there yet, it's going to reassess what's going to happen to this town centre site. And we see, as you say, it could be a flexible option to allow all sorts of appropriate town centre sites. But if it is being put forward as meeting a specific need, then the policy would have to meet that objective. So it all depends on what the evidence base is for an objective.
Yeah, well aware of those implications. We've run out of time. There was one further site. Was anybody here today to discuss the final site, which was land at Schofields Road? There's two people. Apologies, we have run out of time, and obviously I don't want to sort of rush through this particular site. So mindful there are some detailed questions and some potential wording changes that need to be made. So we are going to have to discuss it at another time. We do have reserved sessions in the schedule, one of which I believe is next Tuesday. Would you be able to come back and discuss this at another time?
Hi, Susanna Sunlon from the Number One Community Trust. I wouldn't be able to make next Tuesday, unfortunately.
What about later on this afternoon? Questions to the council as well, really, because we've got this afternoon session on transport. But I just wonder whether we could sort of tag this on at the end of it.
That would be easier for me.
Unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to do that.
Well, so what about if we start with it first thing, and then move on to transport? And if we need to go on later with transport, we can, because everyone will be here.
That's a good idea. So you both, obviously, if we have a short lunch break now for half an hour, are you okay? Both at 2 o'clock? Are you free at 2 o'clock?
Yes, that works for me.
Yeah.
I can potentially be, but I'm going to have to try and rearrange another meeting.
Okay.
Is the on Friday available? Friday morning?
We've got another session now, haven't we? We've got the Turnham Farm site on Friday, I believe.
Or Monday morning.
I can't do Monday. I can't do next week at all.
Okay, well, let me just try and rearrange my meetings this afternoon.
I tell you what, we'll break for lunch. We'll return at 2 o'clock. We'll deal with this first. Ms. Stevens, if you can't make that, then I will, through the programme officer, we'll arrange something else for you to either sort of make representations either in writing or verbally. So let's do that. And then if you can't, for whatever reason, rearrange that separate meeting, then through Charlotte, the programme officer, we'll find a suitable time that you can make your representations.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
Neither representative will have been sent the link for this afternoon because they weren't intending to attend that session, so they will need to be sent the link this afternoon.
Chris, could you do that, please? If you're still on the call.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. We'll have a shorter lunch, but we will have time this afternoon. So we'll adjourn then for lunch and resume back at 2 o'clock. We'll deal with that issue first. And if the second representative can't make it, don't worry, we will still definitely find a space in the schedule to hear you at a later date. Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone.